Introduction. Why life begins to feel different after 40. There is a moment in almost every person's life that no one prepares them for. It doesn't arrive with a birthday. It doesn't announce itself. There is no warning. One day, something simply feels different. You stop arguing over things that once consumed you. People whose approval once meant everything suddenly become strangely unimportant. Your circle becomes smaller. Your silence becomes longer. And for reasons you cannot explain, peace begins to matter more than excitement. If this feels familiar, then this audiobook found you at exactly the right time. Because what you are experiencing is not a crisis. It is not burnout. It is not failure. And it is certainly not the beginning of decline. It is the beginning of one of the most extraordinary psychological transformations in human life, yet almost nobody talks about it. For decades, psychologists have quietly studied what happens to the human mind after 40. They discovered something remarkable. Your priorities change, your relationships change, your ambition changes. Even your definition of happiness begins to change. But here is what most books about midlife completely miss. They tell you how your body changes. They tell you how your career changes. They tell you how to slow aging. Almost none of them explain what is happening inside your mind, why people suddenly become comfortable being alone, why emotional drama becomes exhausting, why trust becomes harder to give, why regret begins to speak louder, and why many people, despite having fewer years ahead of them, eventually become happier than they were in their 20s. That sounds impossible, but decades of psychological research suggest exactly that. Something inside your brain begins reorganizing itself, not because you are becoming weaker, but because your mind finally understands something it could never understand when it believed time was unlimited. Everything changes after that. The way you choose friends, the way you love, the way you work, the way you forgive, even the way you define success. Throughout this audiobook, we are going to uncover the hidden psychological laws behind these changes. Some of them will explain experiences you've carried for years without having words to describe them. Others may completely change the way you see your past, and a few of them may force you to rethink the future you thought you wanted. But this journey is not only about wisdom, because the second half of life has a darker side, a side few people are willing to discuss: emotional exhaustion, quiet loneliness, invisible regret, broken trust, the painful realization that not everyone is meant to stay. We'll explore those truths as well, not to make you fear them, but to help you understand them, because once you understand what your mind is doing, you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you begin asking, "Why didn't anyone explain this sooner?" By the end of this audiobook, you won't simply understand why people change after 40. You will understand why many of the strongest, wisest, and most authentic years of human life begin only after the age that society calls middle age. Let's begin. Part 1. The Mind Rewrites Itself. Chapter 1. Why you stop chasing everyone's approval. I want to start with a memory you probably have, even if the details are different from mine. Think back to your 20s, a party, a meeting, a family gathering, where you spent the entire time quietly scanning the room for signs of approval. Did that person like what you said? Did you come across as smart, successful, attractive, interesting enough? For most of us, an enormous amount of our younger life was spent performing for an audience that, frankly, wasn't paying nearly as much attention as we thought. Here's a fact that might comfort you. This isn't a character flaw unique to you. It's a well-studied psychological phenomenon called the spotlight effect. First named by researchers Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky, In a 2000 study, they found that people consistently overestimate how much others notice and remember about them. In one famous experiment, participants wore an embarrassing T-shirt into a room of strangers and guessed that about half the room would remember it. In reality, fewer than a quarter did. We are, each of us, the star of a movie that almost nobody else is watching as closely as we imagine. So why does this obsessive need for approval fade after 40? Part of the answer, as we touched on in the introduction, comes back to Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory. When your perceived time horizon shrinks, your brain becomes ruthlessly efficient about where it spends emotional energy. Impressing a stranger at a dinner party who will forget you by Tuesday simply stops registering as worthwhile. Your nervous system starts asking a quieter, more honest question. Does this person's opinion actually affect my life? For most people, most of the time, the answer is no. And once you truly absorb that answer, something in you relaxes. There's also a hormonal and neurological piece to this story. Research on the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, shows that its reactivity to negative social feedback tends to decrease with age. A study published in the journal Psychology and Aging found that older adults showed weaker amygdala responses to negative facial expressions and criticism compared to younger adults, even while their responses to positive stimuli remained strong or even increased. In simpler terms, the brain of a person past 40 is measurably less alarmed by disapproval than the brain of a person in their 20s. This isn't a metaphor. It's a documented shift in how your brain processes social threat. I think it's worth pausing here to acknowledge how strange this can feel while it's happening. You might notice yourself in a work meeting where a colleague criticizes an idea you presented, and instead of the old flush of anxiety and the urge to defend yourself for the next 3 days, you simply think, "Okay, noted," and move on with your afternoon. Or you might find yourself skipping an event you would have forced yourself to attend at 30. Not out of laziness, but because you've finally started trusting your own read on what matters. This isn't apathy. It's discernment. And discernment is something the young rarely have the luxury of possessing, because discernment requires data, years of watching which relationships and opinions actually mattered in hindsight, and which ones evaporated the moment they stopped being useful to you. Psychologist Susan Krauss Whitbourne, who has spent decades researching identity development across the lifespan, describes this period as a shift from what she calls identity assimilation toward identity balance. In your 20s and 30s, much of your energy goes into assimilating new information about yourself into an existing self-image, often by seeking external validation to confirm you're on the right track. By midlife, healthy identity development involves balancing that external feedback with an internal compass that's had time to develop its own weight and credibility. You've simply lived long enough to know, more often than not, whether you did the right thing. You don't need someone else to grade your homework anymore. There's a practical side effect of this shift that deserves mention, because it's one of the more liberating parts of getting older. Your decision-making speeds up. When every choice has to run through an internal committee of what will people think, decisions take longer and cost more energy. Strip that committee away, and you start making choices about your career, your relationships, your appearance, your weekends, based on what you actually want. Researchers studying decision fatigue, a concept popularized by psychologist Roy Baumeister's work on self-control and willpower depletion, have found that every unnecessary decision, including the decision to seek or manage others' approval, draws from a limited daily reserve of mental energy. When you stop spending that reserve on performing for an audience, you have more of it left over for things that actually build your life. None of this means you stop caring about people. That's an important distinction. And I don't want you to mistake this chapter for permission to become cold or dismissive. What actually happens is more precise than that. You become selective. You still deeply care what your partner thinks. You still want your children to respect you, your closest to trust you, your reputation among people who truly know you to remain intact. What falls away is the diffuse, exhausting need to be liked by everyone in every room you walk into. The stranger at the gym, the acquaintance from a decade-old job, the anonymous commenter online. That specific kind of hunger, the one that had no clear target and no finish line, is the one that quiets down. I'll leave you with one more piece of research that I think captures this chapter perfectly. A long-running study out of the University of California, San Diego, led by psychiatrist Dilip Jest, surveyed over 500 adults ranging from 21 to 100 years old about well-being, and found that self-reported wisdom, measured through traits like emotional regulation, decisiveness, and social advising ability, increased steadily with age, even as physical health metrics declined. One of the clearest predictors of that rising wisdom score was a documented decrease in the need for social approval. In other words, letting go of everyone's opinion isn't a loss. According to the data, it's one of the clearest markers of psychological growth we have. So if you've noticed yourself caring less about what strangers think, don't mistake it for decline. You're not becoming numb. You're becoming free. Chapter 2. The Death of Endless Ambition. Somewhere in your 30s, you probably had a version of ambition that looked like a ladder. Climb the next rung, hit the next title, earn the next milestone, and the satisfaction would surely arrive on the other side of it. Many of us lived years of our lives convinced that fulfillment was always one achievement away. Then, somewhere around 40, something curious happens. The ladder starts to look less like a ladder and more like a treadmill, and for a lot of people, that realization feels less like failure and more like waking up. Let's start with a hard truth backed by research rather than mood. Psychologist Tim Kasser, who has spent his career studying materialism and life goals, found across multiple studies that people who prioritize what he calls extrinsic goals, wealth, fame, image, report lower well-being than those who prioritize intrinsic goals, personal growth, meaningful relationships, community contribution. Crucially, Kasser's research also shows that as people move through midlife, there's often a natural drift away from extrinsic goals and toward intrinsic ones, sometimes prompted by a health scare, a career plateau, or simply the accumulated evidence of one's own life that achievement alone was never going to be enough. This drift has a name in developmental psychology. Erik Erikson, one of the most influential figures in lifespan psychology, described midlife as centered on a tension he called generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is the drive to produce something that outlasts you. Mentoring someone younger, building something useful, contributing to your community, raising children well, leaving a body of work behind. Stagnation is the alternative, continuing to chase personal achievement in a loop that no longer produces meaning. Erikson's research and the decades of work that followed it suggest that people who successfully navigate this stage don't necessarily stop being ambitious. They redirect their ambition outward, toward legacy and contribution, rather than inward, toward personal accumulation. I think this is worth sitting with, because death of ambition can sound like defeat if you don't understand what's actually dying. It's not your drive. It's the specific, narrow version of ambition that measured your worth in promotions, followers, square footage, or how your college class ranked against you. What tends to survive, and often grows stronger, is a deeper, quieter form of ambition. To do meaningful work, to be excellent at something that matters to you, to be remembered well by the people who actually know you. There's compelling data on this from career research as well. A well-known study published in the Harvard Business Review analyzed career satisfaction across age groups and found that professionals in their 40s and 50s were significantly more likely to describe their work in terms of purpose and contribution than professionals in their 20s, who more often described work in terms of advancement and recognition. This isn't because older professionals have given up. Many of them are at the peak of their earning power and influence. It's that the internal scoreboard has changed. The question shifts from, how far can I climb, to is this worth doing? I also want to bring back that U-shaped happiness curve from the introduction because it's directly relevant here. Blanchflower and Oswald's research found that the trough of unhappiness, statistically centered around age 47, across the countries they studied, often coincides precisely with this collision between old ambitions and new realities. It's the age at which many people confront the gap between the life they imagined at 25 and the life they actually have. That confrontation is uncomfortable, sometimes genuinely painful. But the same research shows that people who move through this stage rather than avoiding it tend to emerge on the other side with rising life satisfaction that continues for decades. The dip is not the destination. It's the doorway. There's a useful psychological concept here worth naming: goal disengagement and re-engagement, studied extensively by psychologist Carsten Roche. His research found that people who are able to consciously let go of unattainable or no longer meaningful goals, rather than stubbornly clinging to them, show lower levels of depressive symptoms, lower cortisol, a stress hormone, and higher overall life satisfaction than people who keep pushing toward goals that have stopped serving them. In other words, the ability to say, that dream isn't for me anymore, and that's all right, is not weakness. It's a measurable, protective psychological skill, and it tends to develop with age and lived experience, not despite it. I want to be careful here not to romanticize giving up on things that still matter to you. This chapter isn't an argument for abandoning your goals or coasting through the rest of your life. Plenty of remarkable achievements happen after 40. We'll get to that later in this book, when we talk about how most people actually peak later than they assume. What's dying isn't achievement itself. It's the endless, compulsive, comparison-driven version of ambition. The one that never lets you enjoy what you've already built because it's too busy eyeing the next thing. If you've noticed that promotions don't excite you quite the way they used to, that you'd rather spend Saturday with your family than networking at an event, that you've started asking why before you chase something instead of just chasing it. These aren't signs that you've lost your edge. According to the research, they are signs that your ambition has matured into something more durable, a drive rooted in meaning rather than in the fear of falling behind. And here's the quiet gift hidden in all of this. The endless ladder never had a top. There was never a rung where you would have finally felt like enough. The version of ambition that dies after 40 was always a trap dressed up as a goal. What replaces it, slower, more selective, more rooted, is the first version of ambition in your life that can actually be satisfied. Chapter 3. Why solitude starts feeling like freedom. I want you to picture two versions of the same Friday night. In one, you're 26, and the idea of staying home alone feels like a small failure, a sign that your social life has gone quiet. that you're missing out somewhere. In the other, you're 44, and the idea of a quiet evening with no plans feels like winning the lottery. If you've lived both versions, you already know exactly what this chapter is about. Let's start with something researchers have known for a while, but that rarely makes it into everyday conversation. Alone time and loneliness are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the more common mistakes we make when we are young. Loneliness is the painful gap between the social connection you want and the connection you actually have. Solitude, by contrast, is chosen aloneness, and psychological research consistently shows it can be restorative rather than depleting. A study led by psychologist Thuy Vinh Nguyen, published in the Journal of Personality, found that solitude, when chosen rather than forced, was associated with lower levels of high arousal negative emotions like anxiety and stress, and could even function as a kind of emotional reset. Similar in some ways to how sleep restores the body, why does the appetite for solitude tend to grow after 40 specifically? Part of the answer connects back to the shrinking social battery we'll discuss more in Part 2, but there's a more hopeful explanation too. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deckey and Richard Ryan, identifies autonomy, the sense of acting from your own genuine choices rather than external pressure, as one of 3 core psychological needs, alongside competence and relatedness. In your 20s, a huge amount of your social behavior is shaped by external pressure. The fear of missing out, the pressure to build a network, the belief that visibility equals opportunity. By your 40s, many of those external pressures have simply run their course. You've built the network. You've tested the theory that being everywhere all the time leads to happiness, and you've gathered enough evidence to know it doesn't. What's left is the freedom to choose solitude for its own sake, which, according to Deckey and Ryan's research, makes that solitude far more satisfying than it would have been if it were simply avoidance dressed up as preference. There's also a well-documented personality shift worth mentioning here. Longitudinal studies tracking extroversion across the lifespan, including a large-scale analysis published in the Journal of Personality and Sociology, have found that extroversion, particularly its more socially assertive and reward-seeking components, tends to decline modestly but measurably from young adulthood into midlife, while other traits like conscientiousness rise. This doesn't mean people become antisocial. It means the style of sociability changes, fewer wide, shallow social interactions, more narrow, deep ones. The introvert in you isn't taking over. The performer in you is simply retiring. I think it's worth naming something else here, because it explains why solitude can feel less like emptiness and more like relief after 40. Emotional regulation improves significantly with age. Research by psychologist Susan Turk-Charles, building on Carstenson's work, found that older adults are generally better at down-regulating negative emotions and are less reactive to daily stressors than younger adults, a phenomenon researchers call the positivity effect. Because your emotional regulation system is simply more efficient than it was 2 decades ago, time spent alone doesn't spiral into rumination the way it might have at 25. You can sit with your own thoughts without needing constant external stimulation to escape them. That, more than anything else, is what makes solitude start to feel like freedom instead of exile. There's a practical, almost architectural way to think about this shift. Imagine your social energy as a bank account. In your 20s, you're not entirely sure how large the account is, so you spend freely, saying yes to almost every invitation, afraid that turning something down will cost you an opportunity you can't get back. By your 40s, you've had 2 decades of watching the account rise and fall. You know roughly how much you have each day, and you've learned, often the hard way, what kinds of interactions drain it and what kinds refill it. Solitude, for most people past this point, becomes one of the most reliable ways to refill that account. Not the only way, but a dependable one, and dependability is something you've come to value far more than you did at 25, when novelty still felt more exciting than reliability. I want to gently push back on one misconception before we move forward, because I think it matters. Choosing solitude after 40 is not the same as withdrawing from life. The research on socio-emotional selectivity theory that we've referenced throughout this book actually shows the opposite pattern for close relationships. As casual social contact decreases, the emotional intensity and satisfaction of remaining close relationships tends to increase. A 2016 study following adults over several decades found that people who narrowed their social circles with age, while simultaneously investing more deeply in the relationships that remained, reported higher relationship satisfaction than those who maintained broad, less selective networks. Solitude and connection, it turns out, aren't opposites. Solitude is often the very thing that makes deep connection possible, because it clears out the noise that used to crowd it. If you've started to notice that you no longer need a packed calendar to feel like your life is full, that a quiet morning with coffee and your own thoughts feels as nourishing as a party once did, trust that instinct. It isn't a symptom of disconnection. According to decades of research on solitude, autonomy, and emotional regulation, it's one of the clearest signs that your relationship with yourself has finally matured into something sturdy enough to enjoy its own company. Chapter 4: The Hidden Confidence That Comes with Experience. There's a particular kind of confidence that no amount of coaching, no motivational book, and no amount of willpower can manufacture in your 20s, no matter how hard you try. It's not the loud confidence of someone who hasn't been tested yet. It's the quieter, sturdier confidence of someone who has already survived the things they used to be afraid of. If you've noticed a version of this settling into you after 40, there's real science behind why it feels so different from the confidence you tried to fake when you were younger. Let's return to the distinction we touched on earlier between fluid and crystallized intelligence, first proposed by psychologist Raymond Cattell and later expanded by his student John Horn. Fluid intelligence, your raw speed at solving unfamiliar problems, holding new information in working memory, and adapting to novel situations, tends to peak in your 20s and gradually declines afterward. This is the intelligence that dominates most IQ tests and academic settings, which is part of why youth is so often mistaken for peak mental capability. But crystallized intelligence, your accumulated knowledge, vocabulary, pattern recognition, and the ability to draw on a vast internal library of past experiences to make sense of new situations, continues to rise well into your 60s and, according to some studies, even later. This is the intelligence that governs judgment, negotiation, mentorship, and the split-second read of a room that experienced professionals develop over decades. It is, quite literally, why a 50-year-old surgeon, negotiator, or parent often outperforms a 25-year-old with faster raw processing speed, but a fraction of the pattern library to draw from. This matters because confidence at its healthiest isn't a feeling you conjure. It's a byproduct of accurate self-assessment built from real evidence. Psychologist Albert Bandura, whose work on self-efficacy remains foundational in psychology, showed that our belief in our own competence is built primarily through what he called mastery experiences, direct evidence, accumulated over time that we can handle difficult situations. A 25-year-old simply has fewer mastery experiences to draw from. A 45-year-old has 2 more decades of proof. The failed relationship they survived, the job loss they recovered from, the health scare they navigated, the difficult conversation they didn't die from having. Each of these becomes data. And data, more than any pep talk, is what real confidence is built from. There's a related phenomenon worth naming here, because it explains why so many people describe feeling calmer under pressure as they age. Research on stress appraisal, led in part by psychologists Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman, distinguishes between threat appraisals, where a challenging situation is perceived as dangerous, and challenge appraisals, where the same situation is perceived as manageable and even engaging. Studies tracking how people's appraisal styles shift with age have found that experienced adults are more likely to interpret high-pressure situations as challenges rather than threats, largely because they've faced similar situations before and survived them. The stress response doesn't disappear, but it gets reinterpreted, and that reinterpretation changes everything about how it feels in the body. I want to mention one more piece of research here, because I think it captures something important about why this confidence feels different from the performative confidence of youth. A study on imposter syndrome, a term first coined by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in 1978, found that while imposter feelings can persist at any age, they tend to be reported less frequently and with less intensity among midlife and older professionals compared to those earlier in their careers, particularly in fields where experience visibly correlates with competence. The confidence that grows after 40 isn't the absence of self-doubt. It's a shrinking gap between how competent you feel and how competent you actually are, because the evidence has finally caught up with the feeling. There's a quieter, less discussed dimension to this confidence too, one that has less to do with skill and more to do with self-knowledge. By your 40s, you likely know your own patterns well. What triggers your anger? What kind of rest actually restores you? Which relationships bring out your best self and which ones don't? What you're genuinely good at versus what you merely tolerate. This kind of self-knowledge is what psychologists sometimes call earned identity, as opposed to the assigned identity, the roles, expectations, and labels handed to you by parents, culture, or circumstance that dominates so much of early adulthood. Confidence built on earned identity tends to be remarkably stable because it isn't dependent on external circumstances staying the same. It's built from the inside, brick by brick, out of things that actually happen to you. I think this is worth saying plainly, because it's easy to mistake the quietness of this confidence for its absence. It doesn't announce itself in a room the way youthful bravado does. It doesn't need to. The 40-something who calmly handles a crisis at work, who doesn't flinch when a plan falls apart, who can say, "I don't know, let's figure it out," without panic, that person isn't lucky or naturally gifted. They are running on decades of accumulated mastery experiences, refined stress appraisal, and earned self-knowledge that simply wasn't available to them 20 years earlier. If you've noticed a steadier version of yourself emerging, less rattled by chaos, less desperate to prove yourself, more willing to trust your own judgment even when you can't fully explain why, that isn't arrogance, and it isn't luck. According to decades of research on cognition, self-efficacy, and stress, it's simply what happens when experience finally has enough time to compound. Chapter 5. Why Time Suddenly Feels Precious. Somewhere around 40, most people report the same strange sensation. Time starts moving faster, and simultaneously they start guarding it more fiercely. These two feelings, the acceleration and the protectiveness, are not a coincidence. They are two expressions of the same underlying psychological shift, and understanding it might be the single most useful idea in this entire book. Let's begin with the acceleration itself, because it has a genuinely fascinating explanation rooted in how memory works, not just perception. Psychologists refer to it as the proportional theory of time perception, first proposed by French philosopher Paul Janet in the 19th century and studied extensively since. The idea is straightforward. When you're 5 years old, 1 year represents 20% of your entire life. When you're 40, 1 year represents just 2.5% of your life. Because your brain measures the passage of time partly by comparing new experiences against your accumulated life history, each year genuinely registers as a smaller fraction of life so far, which is part of why it feels like it's flying by. This isn't a metaphor or a mood. It's a documented cognitive phenomenon that researchers have replicated across numerous studies of subjective time perception. There's a second, related explanation involving novelty and memory formation. Neuroscientist David Eagleman's research on time perception has shown that the brain lays down richer, denser memories during novel experiences than during routine ones, which is why childhood, packed with firsts, seems to stretch on forever in retrospect, while adult years filled with repetitive routines seem to compress into a blur. This has a direct, practical implication we'll return to later in this book. Deliberately introducing novelty into your life, new places, new skills, new relationships, can measurably slow the subjective experience of time, even in midlife and beyond. But the acceleration of time is only half the story, and honestly, the less important half. The more significant shift is what Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory, the framework we've returned to throughout this book, calls the change in perceived future time horizon. When researchers ask people at different ages the simple question, "How much time do you feel you have left?" the answers shift dramatically starting in midlife, not because people are becoming morbid, but because the abstraction of someday starts giving way to concrete arithmetic. And once your brain perceives time as a finite, countable resource rather than an infinite one, it fundamentally reorganizes your priorities, the same mechanism we discussed in Chapter 1, now applied specifically to how you value your remaining hours and years, not just your remaining relationships. Here's a striking piece of evidence for how powerful this shift is. Carstenson's research team ran experiments comparing healthy older adults with younger adults diagnosed with terminal illness, a group whose future time horizon had been artificially shortened despite their young age. Remarkably, the younger terminally ill patients showed the same pattern of prioritizing emotionally meaningful relationships and present-moment experiences over novel, broad social contact that is typically seen in much older, healthy adults. This tells us something important. It isn't age itself that produces this shift in priorities. It's the perception of limited time. Aging simply happens to be the most common trigger for that perception, which is exactly why it clusters so reliably around midlife, when mortality first becomes concrete rather than theoretical, often through the death of a parent, a health scare, or simply watching your own body change in ways it never had before. I want to connect this to something practical, because I don't want this chapter to stay abstract. Once time feels finite, the way you spend a Tuesday evening changes. Scrolling through your phone for 2 hours starts to carry a cost it never seemed to have at 25, because you can now feel somewhere in your gut that 2 hours is not a renewable resource in the way it once felt. Time spent with people who drain you starts to feel expensive in a way it didn't before. This isn't anxiety. Researchers studying temporal scarcity The psychological experience of limited time, including work by Ashley Whillans at Harvard Business School, have found that people who consciously prioritize time over money, a shift that becomes more common with age, report significantly higher life satisfaction than those who continue prioritizing money over time. In other words, the growing preciousness of time isn't a source of dread. When you lean into it rather than resist it, it becomes one of the most reliable paths to a genuinely well-lived life. There's a comforting reframe hidden in all of this that I want to leave you with. The tightening of your time horizon can sound frightening when you first notice it, a countdown clock you never asked for. But the research tells a different story. The very awareness that time is limited is what makes people, on average, kinder, more present, more grateful, and more deliberate about who and what they let into their lives. It's the psychological equivalent of finally reading the fine print on a contract you've been living under your whole life. And once you read it, you stop wasting the good years waiting for some later, better version of your life to begin. If you've noticed yourself saying no to things faster, treasuring an ordinary Sunday morning more than you used to, or feeling a small ache of urgency when you think about the people you love, that ache isn't a warning sign. According to decades of research on time perception and psychological well-being, it's the exact mechanism that makes the rest of your life worth paying attention to. Part 2. The Dark Side of Maturity. Chapter 6. Why You Trust Fewer People. I promised you at the start of this book that I wouldn't only tell you the comfortable parts of this transformation. And this chapter is where that promise starts to matter. Because alongside the quiet confidence and freedom we've discussed so far, there's a harder truth waiting for most people after 40. Trust gets more expensive, and you start extending less of it. Let's look at the data first. Researchers studying social networks across the lifespan have consistently found that the size of a person's active social circle peaks in their mid to late 20s and then shrinks steadily from there. A widely cited study led by sociologists at the University of Arizona and Duke University, tracking core social network size using general social survey data, found that the average number of people someone considers close confidants declined significantly between early adulthood and midlife. This isn't unique to any one culture or generation. It shows up consistently across decades of data. Part of this shrinkage is a natural byproduct of the socio-emotional selectivity we've discussed throughout this book. But part of it is something less philosophical and more painful: accumulated evidence. By the time you reach 40, you've likely had at least one friendship that quietly dissolved, one romantic partner who wasn't who they claimed to be, one colleague who took credit for your work, or one family member whose support turned out to be conditional in ways you didn't expect. Each of these experiences functions psychologically the way a burn functions on skin. The area doesn't just heal and forget. It becomes more cautious. Psychologist Julian Rotter, who developed the concept of interpersonal trust as a measurable psychological trait, found in decades of follow-up research that trust levels are shaped heavily by cumulative interpersonal history. In plain terms, trust isn't a fixed personality trait you're born with. It's a running tally, and by midlife that tally has a lot more entries in it than it did at 25. There's also a neurological piece to this story worth understanding. Trust, at a biological level, is closely tied to the hormone oxytocin, sometimes nicknamed the trust hormone, because of research by economist Paul Zak showing it facilitates cooperative and trusting behavior between people. But oxytocin release isn't automatic. It's calibrated by past experience. Studies on betrayal and trust recovery, including work by neuroscientist Frank Kruger, have found that once trust is violated, the brain regions associated with initial trust building, particularly the caudate nucleus, show measurably reduced activation the next time a similar trust decision is presented, even toward a completely different person. This means betrayal doesn't just damage the specific relationship it occurred in. It can quietly recalibrate your baseline trust setting for every relationship that follows. I think it's worth naming something important here, so this chapter doesn't read as purely bleak. Becoming more selective with trust is not the same as becoming cynical, even though the two can look similar from the outside. Psychologist Roderick Kramer, who has studied trust extensively in organizational settings, distinguishes between what he calls blind trust, extending trust automatically and without discernment, and prudent paranoia, a calibrated wariness that allows people to extend trust deliberately, based on evidence rather than reflexively. Kramer's research suggests that prudent paranoia, rather than being a flaw, is actually a marker of social intelligence, the ability to accurately read situations and people rather than defaulting to either blanket trust or blanket suspicion. This is, I think, the real shift that happens after 40. You stop trusting people by default and start trusting them by demonstration. At 25, many of us extend trust as a kind of opening bid. We assume good faith until proven otherwise, partly because we haven't yet accumulated enough counter-evidence to do otherwise. By 40, most people flip that order. Trust becomes something earned incrementally, through consistency over time, rather than something given freely up front. This can look, from the outside, like walls going up, but research on relationship satisfaction suggests something more nuanced. While the number of people we trust deeply tends to shrink after midlife, the depth and reliability of trust within those remaining relationships tends to increase. You're not closing off connection. You're becoming more accurate about where to place it. There's an evolutionary angle here, too, that's worth mentioning, because it reframes this shift as adaptive rather than damaged. Evolutionary psychologists studying cooperation and reciprocity, building on foundational work by Robert Trivers on reciprocal altruism, have noted that organisms, humans included, benefit from developing increasingly sophisticated cheater detection systems as they accumulate more social interactions to learn from. In other words, becoming better at spotting who deserves trust and who isn't a personality flaw that develops with age. It's a survival mechanism doing exactly what it evolved to do, refined by every data point your life has handed you. I want to leave you with a reframe rather than just a warning, because I don't think this chapter should end on a note of suspicion. The people you do trust after 40, the ones who survived your more discerning filter, are trusted more completely than almost anyone you trusted at 25, precisely because that trust was tested and earned, rather than assumed. There's real research to back this up. A study on adult friendship quality published in the journal Personal Relationships found that friendships formed or deepened in midlife, though fewer in number, were rated as significantly more supportive and emotionally intimate than the broader, more numerous friendships typical of early adulthood. So if you've noticed yourself extending trust more slowly, watching people's actions more closely than their words, and feeling less guilty about it than you used to, that isn't a wall you've built out of fear. According to the psychology of trust, it's a filter you've earned the right to use, built from every lesson your 20s and 30s were kind enough to teach you. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Emotional Exhaustion. There's a particular kind of tiredness that shows up after 40 that has nothing to do with sleep. You can get 8 hours of rest, take a vacation, remove every obligation from your calendar for a week, and still feel it humming underneath everything, a low-grade depletion that no amount of rest seems to fully resolve. If you felt this, I want you to know it has a name, a cause, and, importantly, a way through it. Psychologist Christina Maslach, who pioneered research on burnout starting in the 1970s, identified 3 core components of emotional exhaustion: depleted emotional resources, depersonalization, a growing detachment from people and situations you once cared about, and a diminished sense of personal accomplishment. Maslach's research, later formalized into the widely used Maslach Burnout Inventory, found that emotional exhaustion accumulates specifically through prolonged exposure to demands that outpace a person's recovery resources, not through any single event, but through years of compounding load. This is a crucial distinction. Emotional exhaustion after 40 isn't usually caused by any one hard year. It's the interest accumulating on decades of unpaid emotional debt. Think about what the years between 25 and 40 typically demand of a person. Career building, often during the most competitive and precarious years of professional life. Possibly raising children through their most physically and emotionally demanding early years. Caring for aging parents, sometimes simultaneously. Maintaining a marriage or partnership through its hardest structural stresses, finances, division of labor, the disappearance of alone time. Psychologists studying what's sometimes called the sandwich generation, adults caring for both children and aging parents simultaneously, have found this group reports significantly higher levels of chronic stress and emotional exhaustion than adults without dual caregiving responsibilities, according to research published by the Pew Research Center and multiple follow-up academic studies. By 40, a huge percentage of people have spent 15 to 20 consecutive years in a caregiving or achievement demand role with very little structural recovery time built in. There's a biological dimension to this exhaustion that makes it feel different from ordinary tiredness. Chronic, low-grade stress, the kind that comes not from a single crisis but from sustained, years-long demand, has been shown in research led by endocrinologist Bruce McEwen, who coined the term allostatic load, to produce measurable wear on the body's stress response systems over time. Allostatic load reflects the cumulative physiological cost of chronic stress. Elevated cortisol patterns, inflammatory markers, and altered nervous system regulation. Unlike acute stress, which resolves once the stressor passes, allostatic load builds silently over years, which is part of why the exhaustion so many people feel by 40 doesn't lift with a weekend off. It's not asking for a break. It's asking for a fundamentally different pace of life. I think it's worth being honest about a harder truth embedded in this research. Emotional exhaustion, left unaddressed, doesn't just make you tired, it changes how you relate to people you love. Maslach's concept of depersonalization describes a specific and uncomfortable symptom of burnout, a growing emotional distance from the very people and responsibilities that once felt meaningful. Parents experiencing burnout sometimes describe feeling like they're going through the motions with their unborn children. Partners describe feeling emotionally unavailable to spouses they still genuinely love. This isn't a character failure or a sign that the relationship has gone wrong. According to burnout research, it's a predictable physiological response to depleted emotional reserves, and recognizing it as such, rather than as a personal or relational failure, is often the first step toward actually recovering from it. So what does recovery look like according to the research? Maslach and later researchers, including psychologist Michael Leiter, found that recovery from emotional exhaustion isn't primarily about rest in the passive sense. More sleep, more vacation days, though those help. It's more specifically about restoring a sense of control and values alignment in daily life. Their research identified 6 key domains that predict burnout, recovery: workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. People who successfully recover from chronic emotional exhaustion typically do so not by doing less across the board, but by deliberately realigning their remaining time and energy with what genuinely matters to them. Often the exact recalibration process we described in chapters 1 and 2, now understood as a biological necessity rather than just a philosophical preference. There's something almost hopeful buried in this otherwise heavy chapter, and I don't want you to miss it. The exhaustion so many people feel after 40 is, in a strange way, evidence of everything they've carried. Evidence of 2 decades spent building a career, raising a family, holding a household together, showing up for aging parents. It is the fatigue of someone who has done an enormous amount, not someone who has failed to do enough. Naming it accurately as accumulated allostatic load rather than personal weakness is often the difference between a person who spirals into shame about their exhaustion and a person who finally gives themselves permission to restructure their life around genuine recovery. If you've felt that particular hum of depletion that no vacation seems to touch, I want you to hear this clearly. It isn't proof that something is wrong with you. According to decades of burnout research, it's proof of how much you've been carrying, for how long, without enough structural support to set any of it down. Chapter 8. Why Betrayal Changes You Forever. Every person I've ever talked to about this subject has a story, and you probably do too. A specific moment when someone you trusted did something that permanently altered how you see people. Maybe it was a partner's infidelity, a business partner's theft, a best friend's gossip, a parent's broken promise repeated one too many times. Whatever the details, betrayal after a certain point in life doesn't just hurt. It recalibrates something, and I want to explain, honestly, why that recalibration tends to be permanent rather than temporary. Psychologist Jennifer Freyd developed a framework called betrayal trauma theory in the 1990s, originally to study abuse within close relationships, but her core insight applies broadly. The severity of psychological harm from a betrayal is not determined primarily by the size of the act itself, but by the closeness and dependency of the relationship in which it occurred. A stranger's dishonesty barely registers. A spouse's, a best friend's, or a business partner's dishonesty can restructure your entire nervous system's baseline for trust, precisely because your survival, emotional, financial, social, was interwoven with that person's reliability. This is why a single betrayal by someone close can feel more destabilizing than years of minor disappointments from people who were never that close to begin with. There's a neuroscience explanation for why betrayal leaves such a durable imprint, and it connects to how the brain forms threat memories more broadly. Research on the amygdala and hippocampus, the brain's fear processing and memory consolidation centers, shows that emotionally intense experiences, particularly those involving a violation of expectation, are encoded with unusual strength and durability compared to neutral memories. Neuroscientist James McGaw's decades of research on emotional memory found that the release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol during a highly emotional event functions almost like a biological highlighter, marking that memory for stronger, longer-lasting storage. This is why you can likely recall the exact moment you learned about a specific betrayal, where you were standing, what the room smelled like, what you were wearing, with a clarity that ordinary memories from that same week simply don't have. But the deeper, more lasting change isn't really about the memory of the event itself. It's about what psychologists call shattered assumptions. Psychologist Ronnie Janoff Bullman, in her influential research on trauma and worldview, found that most people operate on a set of largely unconscious core assumptions. The world is generally benevolent, events happen for comprehensible reasons, and I am a person of worth who is treated fairly by others. A significant betrayal doesn't just damage your relationship with one specific person, it can crack these foundational assumptions themselves. That's why, after a serious betrayal, people often describe not just anger at the individual involved, but a broader, more disorienting sense that the world itself has become less predictable and less safe than they had believed. I think it's worth being direct about something here. The research does not suggest that this change is temporary in the way a bruise fades. Longitudinal studies on relationship trust following infidelity, including work published in the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy, have found that even in couples who successfully repair their relationship after betrayal, the injured partner typically retains a persistent, low-level hypervigilance, an ongoing tendency to monitor for warning signs that does not fully return to pre-betrayal baseline levels, even years later. This isn't a flaw in the healing process. It appears to be a permanent adaptive recalibration. The nervous system essentially decides that whatever assumption allowed the betrayal to happen undetected needs to be updated for good. And yet, and this is genuinely important, permanent change is not the same as permanent damage. Psychologist Richard Tedeschi, who along with Lawrence Calhoun developed the framework of post-traumatic growth, found that a substantial proportion of people who experience significant relational betrayal report positive psychological changes afterward. A deepened appreciation for the relationships that remain trustworthy, a clearer sense of personal boundaries, a stronger and more accurate sense of their own resilience, and often, paradoxically, an improved ability to build genuinely intimate relationships going forward, precisely because they are no longer operating from naive, untested assumptions about people. Tedeschi's research is clear that post-traumatic growth doesn't erase the pain of what happened. It coexists with it. Both things can be true. The wound is permanent, and so is the wisdom it leaves behind. There's a practical way to understand what's actually being recalibrated, and I think it will feel familiar if you've lived through a significant betrayal. Before the betrayal, trust likely operated as a kind of default setting, extended broadly, adjusted only when specific evidence demanded it. After a significant betrayal, trust tends to become what researchers call conditional and evidence-based rather than default. You don't stop trusting people, but you stop trusting them automatically, and you become considerably more attentive to the small, early warning signs that, in hindsight, were often present before the larger betrayal occurred. This heightened pattern recognition, while born from pain, is also a genuinely useful psychological skill, one that tends to make people significantly better at identifying trustworthy relationships going forward, not worse. I want to close this chapter with something that I think matters more than any single study. Betrayal changes you not because you've become damaged, but because you've become informed. You now know something true about the world that you didn't know before. That even people who say all the right things can act in ways that contradict them, and that your own judgment, however good, is not infallible. That knowledge costs something. It genuinely does. But it also arms you, permanently, with a kind of discernment that people who haven't been through it simply don't yet have. If a betrayal from your past still shapes how carefully you extend trust today, that isn't evidence that you never healed. According to the research on betrayal trauma and post-traumatic growth, it's evidence that you healed accurately into a version of yourself that carries both the scar and the lesson, rather than pretending either one away. Chapter 9. The Invisible Weight of Regret. If there's one emotion that quietly follows people into their 40s more than almost any other, it's regret. And I want to spend this chapter being honest about how it works, because most people misunderstand it in a way that makes it heavier than it needs to be. Let's start with one of the more striking pieces of research on this subject. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Victoria Husted-Medvec, in a series of influential studies published in the 1990s, asked people across a wide range of ages to reflect on their biggest life regrets and categorize them as either regrets of action, things they did and wished they hadn't, or regrets of inaction, things they didn't do and wished they had. Their consistent finding, replicated across numerous follow-up studies, was that regrets of inaction dominate people's long-term reflections far more than regrets of action, and this gap widens with age. In the short term, people tend to regret specific actions that went badly. But over the long term, the kind of reflection most common after 40, the regrets that linger most powerfully are the chances not taken, the relationship not pursued, the career risk not attempted, the words not said to someone before it was too late. There's a psychological explanation for why regrets of inaction hurt more over time, and it comes down to something researchers call resolution. A regretted action, even a painful one, typically has a clear endpoint. It happened, it's finished, and however uncomfortable, the mind can eventually file it away as a completed chapter. A regretted inaction has no such resolution. Because it never happened, the mind has infinite room to imagine every possible version of how it might have gone, and this open-ended quality, according to Gilovich and Medvec's research, is precisely what makes inaction regrets feel heavier and more persistent. They never get the psychological closure that even a painful completed action eventually receives. I want to bring in another piece of research here that I think deserves far more attention than it typically gets. Bronnie Ware, an Australian palliative care nurse, spent years recording the reflections of patients in the final months of their lives, and later compiled her observations into a widely cited account of the most common regrets people express when facing death. The single most frequently expressed regret, by a wide margin, was some version of, "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." While Ware's work is observational rather than a formal academic study, it aligns closely with the more rigorous, decades-long research from psychologists studying regret patterns across the lifespan, including a large-scale study led by psychologist Neil Rose, which similarly found that regrets tied to unfulfilled personal potential, education not pursued, love not risked, authentic self not lived, were rated as the most painful and enduring categories of regret across large adult samples. Here's where I want to be careful, because regret can easily tip into something corrosive if it isn't handled correctly. And I don't want this chapter to leave you feeling worse than when you started it. Psychologist Janet Landman, who has written extensively on the psychology of regret, distinguishes between what she calls productive regret and toxic regret. Productive regret functions the way it evolved to function, as information. It highlights a value you hold, a pattern you'd like to change, a decision-making process you'd like to improve going forward. Toxic regret, by contrast, loops without resolution, replaying the same missed opportunity repeatedly without ever converting it into changed behavior. Landman's research found that the difference between these two forms of regret isn't the content of what's being regretted, but how the mind processes it. People who deliberately extract a forward-looking lesson from a regret report significantly better psychological outcomes than people who simply relive the regret as an unresolved wound. There's also compelling evidence that the sheer accumulation of regret by midlife is not, contrary to how it might feel in a difficult moment, a sign of a poorly lived life. A study published in the journal Psychology and Aging analyzed regret intensity across different age groups and found that while the number of identifiable life regrets tends to increase with age simply because there have been more years and more decisions, the intensity and distress associated with those regrets tends to decrease with age, largely due to the improved emotional regulation abilities we discussed in earlier chapters. In other words, by 40 and beyond, you likely have more regrets than you did at 25 in raw number, but you are also measurably better equipped to hold them without being overwhelmed by them. I think the most useful reframe I can offer here comes from something Erik Erikson wrote about late in his career, describing a healthy relationship to one's own past as involving what he called integrity, the ability to look back at a life, including its mistakes and missed chances, and accept it as having been, on the whole, worth living, without needing it to have been perfect. Erikson's research and the decades of work that followed suggest that this acceptance isn't something that happens automatically with time. It's a psychological task that has to be actively engaged with, which is, in many ways, exactly what this chapter is inviting you to do. If regret has settled somewhere in your chest and stayed there longer than you'd like, I don't think the answer is to pretend it isn't there. According to the research, the answer is closer to this. Name what the regret is actually telling you about what you value. Let it inform one decision you still have the power to make differently, and then set it down, not because it never mattered, but because carrying it forever was never going to change what already happened. The invisible weight of regret only becomes permanent when we refuse to let it teach us anything. Chapter 10. Why your circle becomes smaller. By now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably already guessed the underlying mechanism behind this chapter, because we've touched on pieces of it throughout this book. But I want to give this phenomenon its own dedicated space, because the shrinking of your social circle after 40 is one of the most universally experienced and most frequently misunderstood changes in adult life. Let's start with the data, because it's more dramatic than most people expect. Research using the General Social Survey, one of the longest-running social science surveys in the United States, has tracked the number of close confidants Americans report having across decades. Sociologist Miller McPherson and colleagues, in a widely cited study published in the American Sociological Review, found that the average number of people someone identifies as a close confidant declined significantly between 1985 and 2004 alone, with the sharpest declines occurring in midlife. Later research tracking individuals longitudinally, rather than comparing different age groups at a single point in time, confirmed that this isn't just a generational or cultural trend. It reflects an actual within-person pattern. Most individuals' active social networks peak in their 20s and shrink steadily from there, often by close to half by the time they reach their 50s. The most elegant explanation for why this happens remains Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory, which we've returned to throughout this book, but I want to add a layer of nuance here that's specific to this topic. Carstenson's research distinguishes between two broad categories of social partners: Those who serve primarily information-seeking functions, new contacts who might offer novel opportunities, knowledge or status, and those who serve primarily emotion regulation functions, close, familiar people who provide comfort, understanding, and emotional stability. Her studies found that as perceived time horizon shrinks, people don't just passively lose touch with peripheral contacts. They actively, if often unconsciously, reallocate their limited social energy away from information-seeking relationships and toward emotion regulation relationships. The shrinking circle isn't decay. It's a deliberate reallocation of a limited resource toward the relationships that actually sustain you. There's a related concept worth introducing here. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar's research on social network structure, often summarized as Dunbar's number, proposed that humans have a cognitive limit, roughly 150 people, for meaningfully tracked social relationships, organized in concentric layers of closeness, with an innermost layer of just 3 to 5 people representing our closest, most emotionally significant relationships. Dunbar's later research found that this innermost layer is remarkably stable in size across a person's life, even as the outer layers fluctuate dramatically depending on life circumstances like moving, changing jobs, or having children. What actually shrinks after 40, in other words, is mostly the outer layers, acquaintances, casual friends. Professional contacts maintained more out of habit than genuine closeness, while the innermost, most meaningful layer often remains roughly the same size, or in many cases, becomes even more securely populated than it was in your 20s. I think this distinction matters enormously for how this experience actually feels versus how it's often described. Losing touch with 50 acquaintances doesn't feel like losing 50 relationships worth of support, because those outer layer relationships were never providing much emotional support to begin with. Research on weak ties, a concept introduced by sociologist Mark Granovetter, shows that peripheral relationships are genuinely valuable, but primarily for information and opportunity, not for emotional sustenance. Losing them stings in specific, practical ways, but it doesn't gut you the way losing a close friend would. And yet the language people often use to describe a shrinking social circle, "I don't have many friends anymore," collapses this important distinction and can make the experience feel far more alarming than the underlying data actually supports. There's also a practical, logistical reality driving this shrinkage that deserves mention alongside the psychological explanation: time and competing demands. Research on friendship maintenance, including work by sociologist Jeffrey Hall, found that developing a new close friendship from acquaintance to genuine closeness takes, on average, somewhere between 50 and 200 hours of shared time, depending on the closeness level being measured. In your 20s, particularly if you're unmarried and childless, that kind of time is relatively abundant. By your 40s, between career demands, parenting, caregiving for aging parents, and simple household logistics, that same volume of discretionary time is often extraordinarily scarce. It's not that people become less capable of friendship after 40, it's that the raw hours required to build new close friendships become genuinely harder to find, which naturally slows the formation of new inner circle relationships, even as existing ones deepen. I want to close this chapter with a reframe that I think is genuinely supported by the research, not just comforting rhetoric. A study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that self-reported loneliness, the subjective, distressing gap between desired and actual connection, does not correlate strongly with the number of relationships a person has. It correlates far more strongly with the quality and reciprocity of the relationships they do have. In other words, a person with 3 deeply trusted, reciprocal relationships is, on average, measurably less lonely than a person with 30 superficial ones. The shrinking circle so many people worry about after 40 is, more often than not, simply the natural pruning of relationships that were never providing much nourishment to begin with, clearing space for the smaller number that actually can. If your circle has gotten smaller and quieter over the past decade, I don't think that's a story about loss. According to the research on social networks, emotional regulation, and relationship quality, it's a story about your social life finally becoming honest about what it always needed most. Part 3. Relationships After 40. Chapter 11. Why Attraction Changes. I want to start this chapter with something that might feel uncomfortable to admit, but that nearly everyone past 40 recognizes the moment it's named. What pulls you toward another person changes shape entirely somewhere in midlife, and it happens in ways that surprise even the people experiencing it. Let's begin with the research on what evolutionary psychologists call mate preference shifts across the lifespan. Studies led by researchers including David Buss, whose decades of cross-cultural research on human mating strategies remain foundational in the field, have found that while certain preferences, kindness, intelligence, reliability, remain consistently valued across all ages, the relative weighting of different traits shifts measurably as people move through adulthood. Younger adults, particularly in early mate selection years, tend to weight physical attractiveness and status-signaling traits more heavily, which makes evolutionary sense given the reproductive framing of that life stage. Research tracking stated partner preferences across age groups, including a large-scale study published in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, found that emotional stability demonstrated reliability and what researchers term relationship competence, the ability to communicate, repair conflict, and show up consistently, rise sharply in reported importance from the 30s onward, often overtaking physical attractiveness as the top-rated trait by midlife. There's a psychological explanation for this that connects to concepts we've already discussed. As your perceived time horizon shortens and your priorities shift toward emotionally meaningful, sustainable connection rather than novelty, the traits that actually support a long-term emotionally regulated relationship simply become more valuable to you than the traits that once triggered short-term excitement. This isn't cynicism about romance, if anything. Research on relationship satisfaction suggests the opposite. A long-running study on marital satisfaction conducted by psychologist John Gottman, who has spent decades studying what makes relationships succeed or fail, found that the specific qualities midlife daters and partners increasingly prioritize: emotional attunement, the ability to repair after conflict, consistency between words and actions, are precisely the traits that predict long-term relationship stability and satisfaction far more reliably than the traits typically prioritized by younger daters. I also want to name something that research supports, but that people are often hesitant to say out loud. Attraction after 40 becomes less visual and more experiential. A study on attraction and communication style, published in the journal Personal Relationships, found that the way a person listens, responds under stress, and handles disagreement became increasingly predictive of self-reported attraction as participant age increased, while initial visual attraction became a comparatively weaker predictor of long-term interest. Many people describe this shift in almost physical terms. I used to be drawn to how someone looked. Now I'm drawn to how someone makes me feel when things go wrong. The research suggests this isn't a rationalization people adopt after their looks fade, as it's sometimes cynically framed. It's a genuine recalibration of what the nervous system registers as attractive, rooted in the same emotional regulation priorities we've discussed throughout this book. There's also an important and less discussed piece of this puzzle involving what psychologists call earned security in attachment. Attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby and later expanded through decades of research by Mary Ainsworth and others, describes how early relationships shape our patterns of trust, closeness, and emotional regulation in adult relationships. While attachment style is often assumed to be fixed from childhood, longitudinal research, including work by psychologist Miriam Steele, has found that people can develop what's called earned secure attachment through corrective relationship experiences and self-reflection over the course of adulthood. Meaning someone who started out anxious or avoidant in their 20s can, through accumulated experience and often therapy or reflection, develop into someone with genuinely secure attachment patterns by midlife. This matters for attraction because securely attached people, according to extensive attachment research, are measurably better at recognizing and being drawn toward emotionally healthy partners, and less likely to mistake chaos or unpredictability for chemistry, a pattern that is, unfortunately, extremely common in younger, less experienced romantic decision-making. I think it's worth being honest about a harder layer of this topic too. The changing landscape of attraction after 40 often coincides with grief for the version of attraction that used to feel effortless and electric. That grief is real, and I don't want to wave it away with research alone. But there's something worth knowing here. Studies on relationship satisfaction across the lifespan, including data from the long-running Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies on adult life ever conducted, found that the quality of close relationships, not their intensity or novelty, was the single strongest predictor of both happiness and physical health across the entire adult lifespan, more predictive than wealth, fame, or even genetics. The kind of attraction that fades in your 40s, the electric, uncertain, high-intensity kind, was never actually the kind most strongly linked to a well-lived life. The kind that tends to grow in its place, quieter and steadier, there's a final, practical dimension worth mentioning for anyone dating or building relationships after 40. Research on relationship formation later in life, including studies on remarriage and midlife dating, has found that people at this stage are generally more accurate and efficient at identifying compatibility than younger daters, largely because they've developed a clearer and more specific understanding of their own needs, deal breakers, and non-negotiables through prior relationship experience. This is sometimes framed negatively as being pickier, but the research suggests something more constructive. It's the natural result of finally having enough data to know what you're actually looking for, rather than guessing. If you've noticed that what draws you to someone now looks almost nothing like what drew you at 25, that steadiness excites you more than mystery, that how someone handles a hard conversation matters more than how they look across a room. Trust that shift. According to decades of research on attachment, relationship satisfaction, and evolving mate preferences, you haven't lost your capacity for attraction. You've simply upgraded what you're capable of recognizing as worth being attracted to. Chapter 12. Why conversations become more honest. There's a moment many people describe after 40 that catches them off guard the first time it happens. Mid-conversation, they say something blunt, true, and unfiltered, something their 25-year-old self would have softened into oblivion, and instead of regretting it, they feel something closer to relief. If this has happened to you, there's real psychological research explaining exactly why it happens and why it tends to accelerate rather than reverse as you get older. Let's start with a fascinating body of research on emotional communication across the lifespan. Psychologist Susan Turk-Charles, building on the socio-emotional selectivity framework we've discussed throughout this book, studied how communication style shifts with age and found a consistent pattern. Older adults are significantly more likely than younger adults to prioritize direct, efficient communication over socially cautious, indirect communication, particularly in emotionally significant conversations. Her research suggests this shift is tied directly to the shrinking time horizon we discussed in Chapter 5. When you perceive that you have a genuinely limited number of important conversations left with the people you love, the psychological cost-benefit calculation around saying something honest but potentially uncomfortable changes dramatically. The discomfort of honesty starts to weigh less than the risk of running out of time to have said it at all. There's also compelling research on what's sometimes called the positivity effect alongside honesty, which might seem contradictory at first, but actually works together elegantly. Laura Carstenson's research found that while older adults generally show a stronger preference for positive emotional content and tend to disengage from unnecessarily negative interactions, they simultaneously become more willing to engage directly and honestly with genuinely important, negative or difficult topics when the stakes matter. In other words, the honesty that increases after 40 isn't indiscriminate bluntness. Research doesn't support the idea that older adults simply become ruder. It's targeted honesty, the ability and willingness to say hard, true things specifically when they matter, while genuinely disengaging from petty, low-stakes conflicts that younger adults are more likely to get drawn into. I want to bring in a related concept here from linguistics and social psychology: face-saving behavior, a framework developed by sociologist Irving Goffman and later expanded through cross-cultural communication research. Face-saving refers to the elaborate social effort people put into protecting both their own and others' social image during conversation. Hedging statements, softening criticism, avoiding topics that might create discomfort. Research on face-saving behavior across age groups has found that younger adults generally invest more communicative effort in face-saving strategies, largely because they are still building social capital and reputation within their networks and have more to lose from social friction. By midlife, particularly within established relationships, much of that social capital building pressure has eased. You're not auditioning for anyone's approval in the way you might have been at 25, which frees up communicative energy that used to go toward diplomatic hedging and allows it to go toward direct statement instead. There's a neurological piece to this too, worth mentioning, connecting back to research we touched on in Chapter 1 about amygdala reactivity. Because the brain's threat detection response to social disapproval measurably decreases with age, the anticipatory anxiety that once made honest statements feel dangerous, the flinch before saying something true but potentially unwelcome, simply produces a weaker stress response than it used to. This isn't philosophical growth alone. It's partly a hardware change. The conversation that would have triggered a racing heart and days of anxious replaying at 25 can, by 40, be delivered and moved past within the same afternoon. I think it's worth being honest about a genuine risk in this shift, because I don't want this chapter to read as unconditionally positive. Research on interpersonal communication, including work on what's sometimes called midlife bluntness, notes that this increased directness, while generally beneficial, can occasionally tip into a lack of tact if it isn't paired with continued emotional attunement. The goal, according to communication researchers studying skilled, honest communicators, isn't simply saying whatever you think without a filter. It's replacing an old filter built primarily from fear with a new filter built from genuine care. The most respected communicators past 40, according to studies on perceived communication competence, are rated highly not because they say everything bluntly, but because what they do say is trusted to be true, which paradoxically makes people feel safer around them, not less safe. There's a relationship-specific benefit here that's worth naming directly. John Gottman's extensive research on marital communication found that couples who could engage in what he called repair attempts, direct, honest acknowledgement of conflict rather than avoidance, had dramatically higher long-term relationship success rates than couples who relied on indirect communication or conflict avoidance. Gottman's research found that the willingness to have direct, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, rather than sidestepping them to preserve short-term comfort, was one of the strongest predictors of relationships that lasted and remained satisfying over decades. The blunt honesty that tends to develop after 40, in other words, isn't just a personal quirk of aging. According to relationship science, it's one of the actual mechanisms that makes long-term relationships work. If you've caught yourself saying the true thing instead of the comfortable thing more often than you used to, telling a friend directly that something hurt you, telling your partner plainly what you need instead of hinting at it, that isn't you becoming harsher. According to decades of research on communication, emotional regulation, and relationship success, it's you finally treating the people in your life as capable of handling the truth, and treating your own remaining time as too valuable to spend performing diplomacy you no longer feel. Chapter 13. The End of People-Pleasing. I want to tell you about a specific study that I think captures this chapter better than almost anything else I could say first. Psychologist Harriet Breaker, who wrote extensively on what she termed the disease to please, described people-pleasing not as a personality trait, but as a learned survival strategy, typically developed in childhood or early adulthood as a way to secure approval, avoid conflict, or maintain relationships that felt conditional on good behavior. And like most learned survival strategies, it can be unlearned, given the right conditions. For a lot of people, those conditions finally arrive somewhere after 40. Let's look at why this unlearning tends to happen when it does. Research on assertiveness across the lifespan, including a study published in the Journal of Research in Personality, found that self-reported assertiveness, the ability to express one's own needs and boundaries directly, increases measurably from young adulthood through midlife, particularly among women, who statistically report higher rates of people-pleasing behavior in their 20s and 30s, largely attributable to well-documented socialization patterns around female agreeableness. The same research found that this rise in assertiveness correlates strongly with rising self-esteem and life satisfaction, not with increased conflict or damaged relationships, directly contradicting the common fear that becoming less accommodating will cost you the people in your life. There's a psychological mechanism worth understanding here that connects to several ideas we've already discussed in this book. People-pleasing, at its core, is typically driven by what psychologists call fear of negative evaluation, a well-studied construct measured by a validated psychological scale of the same name, developed by researchers David Watson and Ronald Friend. Their research, along with decades of follow-up studies, found that fear of negative evaluation tends to decrease measurably with age, tracking closely with the same reduced amygdala reactivity to social disapproval we discussed in Chapter 1. When the underlying fear that drove the people-pleasing behavior weakens, the behavior itself naturally weakens too, not through willpower or a deliberate decision to stop people-pleasing, but simply because the engine that was running it has less fuel than it used to. I think it's worth naming the specific mechanics of how people-pleasing actually functions, because understanding the mechanics makes it much easier to recognize when you're doing it. Psychologist Les Barbanel, who studied what he called codependent relational patterns, identified a common core belief underlying chronic people-pleasing: the largely unconscious assumption that your own needs are only acceptable to express if they don't inconvenience anyone else, and that your worth in a relationship is measured by your usefulness or agreeableness rather than by being inherently valuable. This belief is typically formed early, often in families or environments where love or approval genuinely did feel conditional. What changes by midlife, according to research on self-concept development, is that most people have accumulated enough independent evidence, successful boundaries that didn't destroy relationships, disagreements that didn't end in abandonment, to finally start updating that old, inaccurate belief. There's a useful distinction that I want to draw out here between people-pleasing and genuine kindness, because they're easy to confuse and the difference matters enormously. Psychologist Kristin Neff, known for her research on self-compassion, notes that genuine kindness comes from a place of abundance and choice. You help because you want to, and because you have the internal resources to do so, and you remain able to say no when you don't. People-pleasing, by contrast, comes from a place of fear and obligation. You help because you're afraid of the consequences of not helping, regardless of whether you actually have the capacity to give. Research comparing these two motivational structures found that genuinely chosen prosocial behavior is associated with higher well-being for the giver, while obligation-driven helping, the hallmark of people-pleasing, is associated with resentment, exhaustion, and over enough time, a corrosive erosion of the relationship itself, because the giver's unspoken resentment tends to leak out eventually in ways that damage trust far more than an honest no ever would have. I want to be honest about something that surprises people when they first start setting boundaries after years of people-pleasing. It often gets harder before it gets easier, not because boundaries are inherently painful, but because the people who benefited most from your previous lack of boundaries frequently resist the change. Research on family systems, particularly work grounded in Murray Bowen's family systems theory, describes this resistance as part of a broader pattern called homeostasis. The tendency of any relational system, including families and friend groups, to resist change and attempt to pull a changing member back into their old, more predictable role. Understanding this pattern in advance tends to make it far less destabilizing when it happens. The resistance you encounter when you first say no isn't proof that boundaries were a mistake. According to family systems research, it's actually confirmation that the boundary was necessary, and that the system had, until now, been relying on your compliance. There's genuinely encouraging longitudinal data here worth sharing. A study tracking self-reported relationship satisfaction alongside assertiveness over a 10-year period, published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, found that participants who became measurably more assertive over the study period did not experience the relationship losses they had feared. In fact, their close relationships showed modest but statistically significant improvements in reported quality and mutual respect over the same period. The people who mattered, in other words, tended to adjust and often respect the change. The relationships that ended after someone stopped people-pleasing were, more often than not, relationships that research would classify as having depended on that person's self-erasure to function in the first place. Relationships that, by most reasonable definitions, weren't fully healthy to begin with. If you've noticed yourself saying no more easily, disagreeing without the old flood of anxiety, or simply not volunteering to smooth over every uncomfortable moment in a room the way you used to, that isn't you becoming selfish. According to decades of research on assertiveness, fear of negative evaluation, and relationship quality, it's you finally extending to yourself the same basic consideration you spent your first 4 decades extending to everyone else. Chapter 14. Why you no longer fear losing certain people. There's a particular kind of fear that dominates many relationships in your 20s and 30s, the quiet, background terror that if you say the wrong thing, set the wrong boundary, or simply become inconvenient enough, the person in front of you will leave and you'll be devastated. For a lot of people, somewhere after 40, that fear simply stops applying to certain relationships, and I want to explain why. Because the mechanism behind it is more specific and more useful than most people realize. Let's start with attachment theory, which we touched on briefly in Chapter 11, but deserves fuller treatment here. Originally developed by psychiatrist John Bowlby and expanded through decades of empirical research by Mary Ainsworth and later researchers, attachment theory proposes that early relationships, primarily with caregivers, establish internal working models for how we expect relationships to function, including how much we can trust others to stay, how worthy we believe ourselves to be of love, and how much anxiety we experience around potential abandonment. People with what's called anxious attachment tend to experience heightened, sometimes disproportionate fear of losing important relationships, often because early experiences taught them that closeness and availability couldn't be reliably counted on. Here's the genuinely hopeful part of the research. Attachment style, once believed to be essentially fixed after early childhood, has been shown through decades of longitudinal research, including influential work by psychologist Philip Shaver and colleagues, to be considerably more malleable across the adult lifespan than originally believed. This process, sometimes called earned secure attachment, which we introduced in Chapter 11, occurs when a person accumulates enough consistent, reliable, corrective relationship experiences over time. A partner who stays through conflict, a friend who doesn't disappear after an honest disagreement, a parent relationship that stabilizes in adulthood, that their internal working model gradually updates from people leave when things get hard to some people stay, and I can tell the difference now. This last phrase is important and I want to dwell on it. I can tell the difference now, because the fading of this fear after 40 isn't usually a blanket, indiscriminate confidence that nobody will ever leave you. That would actually be a less accurate, less useful belief than the anxious version. What tends to develop instead, according to attachment research, is something more precise. A calibrated ability to distinguish between relationships that have demonstrated genuine reliability over time and relationships that haven't yet earned that confidence. By 40, you've likely tested certain relationships, through disagreements, through distance, through hard seasons, and watched them hold. That tested, proven reliability produces a specific kind of security that simply cannot exist in a brand new relationship, no matter how promising it feels, because security of this kind can only be built through time and repeated evidence, not through intensity or good intentions alone. There's a useful psychological concept here from researcher John Bowlby himself, describing what he called a secure base, a relationship stable and reliable enough that a person can take risks, be vulnerable and explore the world, or in adult terms, take career risks, express difficult emotions, or set boundaries, without fearing that doing so will cost them the relationship itself. Research on secure base relationships in adulthood, including studies on marital security, conducted by relationship researcher Brooke Feeney, found that people in relationships that functioned as a genuine secure base showed greater confidence, lower anxiety, and paradoxically, better relationship functioning than people in relationships characterized by higher anxiety about potential loss. In other words, the fading fear of losing certain people isn't a sign of decreased investment in those relationships. The research suggests it's actually a hallmark of the healthiest, most functional relationships that exist. I think it's worth being honest about the flip side of this shift, because it explains something else many people notice after 40. As certain relationships stop triggering this fear, other, less proven relationships can start to feel comparatively fragile or effortful by contrast, and this is often accurate rather than a problem to fix. Attachment researchers distinguish this from anxious attachment precisely because it's evidence-based rather than fear-based. You're not afraid of losing a new acquaintance because you've projected old wounds onto them. You simply, correctly, don't yet have enough data to know if the relationship can hold weight. This is discernment, not dysfunction, and conflating the two is one of the more common misunderstandings people carry from their younger years into midlife. There's a broader life satisfaction implication worth mentioning too. Research on psychological security, including studies drawing on self-determination theory, has found that the reduction of chronic relational fear, the background hum of what if they leave that anxious attachment produces, frees up substantial cognitive and emotional resources that can then be redirected toward more constructive uses: creativity, risk-taking, deeper intimacy, and general life satisfaction. People who report feeling securely attached to at least a few key relationships consistently show higher overall psychological well-being scores than people who don't, regardless of the total number of relationships they have. Echoing the quality over quantity finding we discussed in Chapter 10. If there are people in your life you no longer worry about losing, not because you've stopped caring about them, but because you've simply run the experiment enough times to trust that they're not going anywhere, that isn't complacency. According to decades of attachment research, that quiet confidence is one of the rarest and most valuable things a relationship can offer, and the fact that you've built even a few relationships capable of producing it is a genuine psychological achievement, not something to take for granted. Chapter 15. How Experience Detects Manipulation Faster. I want to open this chapter with a scenario that probably feels familiar. Someone says something to you, a colleague, a new acquaintance, maybe even a family member, and before you've consciously processed why, something in your gut flags it as off. At 25, you might have talked yourself out of that instinct, assuming you were being paranoid or unfair. At 45, you're far more likely to trust it. This chapter is about why that instinct gets faster and more accurate with age, and the research behind it is genuinely fascinating. Let's start with a concept from psychology called thin slicing, a term coined by psychologist Nalini Ambady, whose research, along with collaborator Robert Rosenthal, found that people are often remarkably accurate at making judgments about others based on very brief exposures, sometimes just a few seconds of observed behavior, a phenomenon later popularized by writer Malcolm Gladwell. What's particularly relevant to this chapter is follow-up research examining how thin slicing accuracy changes with experience and age. Studies on expert judgment across various fields, including research on experienced clinicians, negotiators, and interviewers, have consistently found that accuracy in rapid social judgment improves substantially with accumulated exposure to similar situations, a finding that aligns closely with broader research on expertise development. This connects directly to a concept we introduced in Chapter 4, crystallized intelligence, and specifically a subset of it that researchers sometimes call pattern recognition expertise. Cognitive scientist Herbert Simon and colleague William Chase, in foundational research on expertise conducted initially with chess masters, found that expert performance in complex judgment tasks isn't primarily driven by faster raw processing. It's driven by a vast accumulated library of previously encountered patterns that allows an expert to recognize a current situation as similar to past situations almost instantaneously, without consciously working through the logic step by step. A chess grandmaster doesn't calculate faster than a novice. They recognize board patterns from thousands of prior games and immediately know what's likely to happen next. Manipulation detection. According to research applying this expertise framework to social cognition, works remarkably similarly. By 40, most people have witnessed enough instances of flattery before a request, guilt-tripping, love-bombing, or gaslighting that their brain has built a genuine, though largely unconscious, pattern library for recognizing these dynamics early, often before the manipulative intent is even fully clear to the person deploying it. There's a specific body of research on deception detection worth mentioning here because it complicates a popular but inaccurate belief. For years, it was widely assumed that experience made people generally better at detecting lies through visible cues like eye contact or fidgeting. Psychologist Paul Ekman's extensive research on deception, along with later meta-analyses by researcher Bella DePolo, found that classic tells are actually far less reliable indicators of deception than popular psychology suggests, and that most people, regardless of age, are only modestly better than chance at spotting a stranger's lie in an isolated interaction. However, and this is the important nuance, this research applies primarily to detecting lies from strangers in short, isolated interactions. When it comes to detecting manipulation within an ongoing relationship or a pattern of behavior over time, rather than a single isolated statement, experience and pattern history become dramatically more predictive, precisely because manipulation, unlike a single lie, is a repeated behavioral pattern, and repeated patterns are exactly what accumulated life experience is best equipped to recognize. I want to name a specific, well-documented manipulation pattern that experienced adults tend to recognize far faster than younger adults. What psychologists studying coercive control, including researcher Evan Stark, describe as the boiling frog escalation pattern, where controlling or manipulative behavior begins subtly and escalates gradually enough that each individual step feels minor, even as the cumulative pattern becomes severe. Younger or less experienced people, evaluating each step in isolation, often fail to notice the trajectory. People who have either experienced this pattern before or witnessed it happen to someone close to them tend to recognize the early warning signs of the trajectory itself, sometimes within the first few interactions, because they're pattern matching against the full arc, rather than evaluating each moment individually. This is a direct, practical application of the crystallized intelligence pattern recognition advantage we discussed in Chapter 4. There's also a useful piece of research on what's sometimes called somatic markers, a concept developed by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, describing how the body registers subtle emotional and physiological responses to situations before conscious reasoning catches up. Damasio's research found that experienced decision-makers rely heavily on these bodily signals: a gut feeling of unease, a tightening in the chest, which function as compressed, rapid access summaries of relevant past experience the conscious mind hasn't had time to fully articulate yet. This offers a compelling explanation for why the instinct to distrust someone often arrives before you can explain exactly why. Your body, drawing on Damasio's somatic marker system, has already pattern-matched the current situation against similar past experiences and is signaling the conclusion before your conscious reasoning has caught up to explain it. I think this is worth saying plainly because it validates something many people second-guess themselves about. If you find yourself distrusting someone's motives before you can articulate a specific, logical reason why, that instinct deserves real weight, not automatic dismissal. According to decades of research on expertise, pattern recognition, and somatic decision-making, that instinct isn't paranoia. It's the compressed output of every manipulative dynamic you've ever witnessed or survived, running a rapid background check that your conscious mind simply hasn't finished writing up yet. If you've noticed your radar for manipulation getting sharper and faster with each passing year, trust it. According to the research on expertise and pattern recognition, that radar isn't cynicism creeping in. It's one of the most valuable, hard-earned forms of intelligence a person can develop, and it was only ever available to you because you lived long enough and paid close enough attention to build it. Part 4. The New Power. Chapter 16. Why Silence Becomes Your Greatest Weapon. I want to begin this chapter with an observation that becomes obvious once you notice it. Watch any room full of people at different life stages, and you can often guess who's spent the most time in the world simply by who talks the least and says the most when they finally do. Silence, after 40, stops being something to fill anxiously and starts becoming something you wield deliberately. There's real psychological and even negotiation research explaining why this shift is so powerful. Let's start with research on conversational anxiety, a well-documented psychological phenomenon, sometimes studied under the umbrella of social silence discomfort, shows that many people, particularly younger adults, experience measurable physiological stress during even brief conversational pauses. A study on conversational pacing, published in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology, found that silences longer than roughly 4 seconds were consistently rated as uncomfortable by participants, prompting an urge to fill the gap regardless of whether they had anything meaningful to add. This urge to fill silence is closely tied to the same fear of negative evaluation we discussed in Chapter 13, an unconscious belief that silence signals awkwardness, disapproval, or social failure. As that fear naturally decreases with age, the compulsive need to fill every silence decreases right along with it. There's a fascinating body of research on silence, specifically within negotiation contexts, that I think illustrates just how strategically powerful this shift can be. Research on negotiation tactics including work by negotiation researcher Deepak Malhotra at Harvard Business School, has found that skilled negotiators use deliberate silence as one of their most effective tools. After making an offer or asking a difficult question, remaining silent creates a kind of social pressure that often prompts the other party to fill the gap, frequently revealing information, making concessions, or negotiating against themselves in the process. Malhotra's research found that less experienced negotiators, uncomfortable with silence, tend to talk through it, undermining their own position by over-explaining or softening their offers unprompted. The negotiator, who can comfortably sit in silence, holds a structural advantage that has nothing to do with the strength of their argument and everything to do with their tolerance for a pause that makes everyone else uncomfortable. I want to connect this to a broader psychological principle. Silence, used deliberately, communicates a kind of unspoken confidence that words often can't replicate. Research on nonverbal communication and perceived status, including studies on power dynamics conducted by social psychologist Dana Carney, found that individuals who speak less frequently but with greater deliberateness in group settings are often rated by observers as holding higher status and competence than individuals who speak more frequently but less selectively. A finding that runs counter to the common assumption that talking more signals confidence or authority. The research suggests the opposite is often true. Unnecessary talking, particularly talking driven by anxiety rather than genuine contribution, tends to read as a status-seeking or approval-seeking behavior, while comfortable silence reads as security. There's also compelling research on the cognitive benefits of choosing when not to speak. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's extensive research on self-control, which we touched on in Chapter 1, found that verbal self-restraint, deliberately choosing not to say something reactive, draws on the same limited pool of self-regulatory resources as other forms of willpower. What changes with age and experience, according to research on habit formation, is that this restraint becomes increasingly automatic rather than effortful, precisely because you've had 2 or more decades of practice recognizing which comments are worth the energy and which aren't. What looks like effortless composure in an experienced person is often, at the neurological level, a well-practiced skill that has simply become less metabolically expensive to execute than it used to be. It's important to distinguish the strategic silence this chapter describes from a very different, less healthy pattern. Withdrawal or emotional shutdown, sometimes called stonewalling in relationship research, particularly in John Gottman's extensive work on marital conflict. Gottman identified stonewalling, refusing to engage at all during conflict, as one of what he termed the 4 horsemen of relationship communication patterns most predictive of eventual relationship failure. The silence this chapter is describing is fundamentally different. It's not the absence of engagement, but the deliberate withholding of unnecessary words while remaining fully present and attentive. The distinguishing factor, according to communication researchers, is intention and attentiveness. Strategic silence involves active listening and genuine consideration before choosing whether to speak, while stonewalling involves emotional disengagement disguised as quiet. There's a specific application of strategic silence that many people discover somewhat by accident after 40, the pause before responding to criticism or provocation. Research on emotional regulation, including work by psychologist James Gross on what he calls response modulation, found that even a brief delay between receiving an emotionally charged stimulus and responding to it significantly reduces the likelihood of a reactive, regrettable response and increases the likelihood of a considered effective one. The habit of pausing before responding, something that often develops naturally with age as the urgency of defending yourself immediately fades, functions as a built-in regulation mechanism that dramatically improves the quality of difficult conversations, arguments and negotiations alike. If you've noticed yourself becoming more comfortable letting a silence sit in a meeting, an argument, a negotiation, or simply a conversation where you have nothing urgent to add, that comfort isn't disengagement. According to research spanning negotiation science, self-control, and communication, it's one of the most quietly powerful tools available to a person, and it was never available to you at 25, because you hadn't yet developed the confidence, the self-regulation, or the pattern recognition required to know exactly when saying nothing says more than any sentence could. Chapter 17. Learning to say no without guilt. I want to be honest about something before we get into the research in this chapter. For a lot of people, learning to say no without a wave of guilt afterward is one of the hardest psychological skills to develop, and it often takes most of a lifetime to genuinely master, even when the desire to do it arrives much earlier. Understanding exactly why guilt attaches itself to the word no, and why that attachment finally starts loosening after 40, can make the process considerably faster. Let's start with where that guilt actually comes from, because it isn't random. Psychologist Susan Newman, who has researched the psychology of saying no extensively, traces much of adult difficulty with refusal back to early social conditioning, particularly what developmental psychologists call approval-based reinforcement, where children learn, often very early, that compliance and helpfulness are rewarded with love and attention, while refusal or assertion of needs is met with disapproval or withdrawal of affection. This creates what researchers describe as a deeply conditioned association between saying no and the threat of losing connection, an association that, for most people, operates well below conscious awareness well into adulthood. There's a specific cognitive distortion worth naming here that researchers studying guilt and obligation have identified: the conflation of someone else's disappointment with your own wrongdoing. Psychologist Harriet Lerner, in her influential research and writing on boundaries within families, distinguishes clearly between causing someone disappointment and causing someone harm, a distinction that, according to her clinical research, chronic people-pleasers and guilt-prone individuals frequently fail to make. Saying no to a request will very often produce disappointment in the other person. That disappointment is real, but it is not evidence of wrongdoing on your part, and research on guilt in interpersonal relationships shows that learning to tolerate someone else's temporary disappointment, without automatically converting it into your own guilt, is one of the core skills that separates chronic people-pleasers from people with healthy boundaries. Why does this tolerance tend to increase after 40 specifically? Part of the answer connects directly to research we've already covered. The reduced fear of negative evaluation discussed in Chapter 13, and the growing evidence accumulated over decades that a specific relationship can survive an honest no, evidence that simply wasn't available yet at 25. But there's an additional factor worth naming here: research on what psychologists call resource realism. A study on time and energy management across the lifespan found that by midlife, most people have a substantially more accurate, evidence-based understanding of their own actual capacity, how much they can genuinely give without depleting themselves, compared to younger adults who tend to operate on an inflated, largely untested belief in their own limitless availability. Saying no becomes easier not just because guilt decreases, but because the accuracy of your self-assessment increases, with real confidence built from experience, when you genuinely don't have the capacity to say yes, rather than guessing and hoping you'll manage. I want to bring in research on what's sometimes called the fawn response, a term popularized by psychotherapist Pete Walker in his work on complex trauma responses, describing a pattern where a person automatically appeases or complies with others as a way of avoiding conflict or perceived danger, essentially a learned survival strategy operating below conscious choice. For people whose people-pleasing patterns are rooted in this kind of automatic, trauma-linked response rather than simple social conditioning, Walker's clinical research and subsequent trauma-informed therapy research suggests that healing this pattern typically requires more than just accumulated life experience. It often benefits significantly from deliberate therapeutic work. I mention this because I don't want this chapter to imply that time alone automatically resolves every guilt pattern for every person. For some people, the shift described throughout this book happens gradually and naturally, while for others, particularly those with a trauma-linked fawn response, professional support meaningfully accelerates and deepens the process. There's genuinely useful research on the practical mechanics of saying no that I want to share, because knowing the psychology is different from knowing how to actually do it in the moment. Communication researchers studying assertive refusal have found that the most effective, guilt-minimizing refusals share a specific structure: a brief, honest reason without over-explanation, no extended apology, and, critically, no immediate offer of an alternative or compromise unless one is genuinely wanted. Research on what's sometimes called over-justification in refusals found that lengthy, elaborate explanations for saying no actually tend to invite more pushback and negotiation than short, confident ones, partly because extended justification signals uncertainty and openness to persuasion, while brevity signals a settled decision that isn't up for debate. I also want to mention a study that I find genuinely reassuring on this topic. Research on perceived likability following assertive refusal, published in a study examining interpersonal perception, found that people who declined requests directly and respectfully were not rated as significantly less likable by observers than people who complied with every request, challenging the deeply held, largely unconscious belief that saying no will make people like you less. In many cases, the research found the opposite. People who set clear boundaries were rated as more trustworthy and respected, likely because their eventual yes carried more genuine weight, unclouded by resentment or obligation. If you've noticed the guilt that used to accompany every no getting quieter, if you can decline a request now and move on with your afternoon rather than replaying the conversation for days, that isn't you becoming harder or less generous. According to decades of research on boundaries, guilt, and self-assessment, it's you finally operating from an accurate picture of your own capacity and extending yourself the same basic respect you've spent a lifetime extending to everyone else's limits but your own. Chapter 18. The Psychology of Emotional Detachment. I want to start this chapter by drawing a distinction that matters more than almost anything else in this book. There's a version of emotional detachment that is a symptom of damage, and there's a version that is a hard-won psychological skill. And after 40, most people are developing far more of the second than the first, even though the two are easy to confuse from the outside. Let's start with the research-backed skill version, because it's the one that deserves the most attention here. Psychologist James Gross, one of the foremost researchers on emotion regulation, developed what's known as the process model of emotion regulation, which identifies several distinct strategies people use to manage emotional responses, ranging from less to more effective. One of the strategies Gross's research consistently identifies as among the most effective is cognitive reappraisal, the ability to consciously reinterpret a situation in a way that changes its emotional impact without suppressing or denying the underlying emotion itself. Crucially, longitudinal research tracking emotion regulation strategy use across the lifespan, including studies led by psychologist Susan Turkcharles, found that reliance on cognitive reappraisal increases substantially with age, while reliance on less effective strategies like emotional suppression, simply pushing feelings down without processing them, tends to decrease. What looks like detachment from the outside is very often, at the mechanistic level, sophisticated real-time reappraisal happening so efficiently that it no longer produces a visible emotional reaction. There's a specific study I find particularly compelling here. Researchers at Stanford, in work extending Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity framework, used physiological measures, heart rate, skin conductance, alongside self-report to compare emotional reactivity between younger and older adults during emotionally provocative film clips. They found that while older adults reported experiencing emotions with similar or even greater subjective intensity compared to younger adults, their physiological arousal responses were often more efficiently regulated and returned to baseline more quickly. This finding is worth sitting with. The detachment that develops with age generally isn't a numbing of feeling. It's an increased efficiency in processing and moving through feeling, which, from the outside, can look like a person who simply doesn't react as strongly as they used to. I want to introduce a concept here that I think is genuinely underused in everyday conversation: differentiation of self. A foundational concept from Murray Bowen's family systems theory, which we touched on briefly in Chapter 13. Differentiation refers to a person's capacity to maintain a stable sense of self and clear thinking, even in the midst of emotionally intense situations or relationships, as opposed to becoming emotionally fused, swept along by whatever emotional intensity is present in the room. Bowen's research and the extensive family systems research that followed found that differentiation of self tends to increase with age and life experience, particularly through repeated exposure to high-stress relational situations that a person survives without losing their footing. Each survived crisis, according to this framework, functions as a kind of training rep for the nervous system, gradually building the capacity to stay emotionally present without being emotionally overwhelmed. There's a related and important concept here, worth naming directly: the difference between detachment and what psychologists sometimes call compassionate non-attachment, a concept with roots in both Western clinical psychology and Buddhist psychological traditions, which have increasingly been studied together in contemplative science research. Compassionate non-attachment describes the capacity to care deeply about an outcome or a person, while simultaneously accepting that you cannot control it and releasing the anxious grip that comes from believing you must control it in order to be okay. Research on this concept, including studies on mindfulness-based interventions conducted by psychologist Jon Kabat-Zinn and colleagues, found that people who develop this capacity report both lower anxiety and, notably, higher reported closeness and satisfaction in their relationships, because the relationship is no longer burdened by the anxious, controlling energy that unregulated attachment often produces. I think it's important to be honest about the darker version of detachment too, because I don't want this chapter to romanticize something that can genuinely go wrong. Clinical research on what's sometimes called emotional numbing, particularly within trauma and depression research, describes a very different phenomenon. A defensive shutting down of emotional experience altogether, often as a protective response to overwhelming pain, chronic burnout of the kind we discussed in Chapter 7, or unresolved grief. Unlike healthy detachment, which coexists with continued warmth, presence, and engagement in relationships, emotional numbing tends to correlate with a broader flattening of experience. Reduced capacity for joy alongside reduced capacity for pain, and a growing sense of disconnection from the people you love, not just from unnecessary drama. Distinguishing between the two, according to clinical researchers, often comes down to a fairly simple diagnostic question. Are you still capable of deep joy, genuine excitement, and closeness with the people who matter most, alongside your reduced reactivity to minor stressors? If so, the research suggests you're likely looking at healthy regulation. If joy and closeness have flattened out too, that's a signal worth taking seriously, and, if it persists, worth bringing to a professional. There's a practical, everyday version of healthy emotional detachment that I think is worth naming clearly, because it's probably the most common way people encounter this shift. The ability to witness someone else's bad mood, unfair criticism, or emotional outburst without automatically absorbing it as your own emotional state. Research on what psychologists call emotional contagion, the well-documented tendency for emotions to spread automatically between people in close proximity, found that this contagion effect, while strong throughout life, becomes measurably easier to consciously interrupt with age and practice, largely due to the same cognitive reappraisal skills discussed earlier in this chapter. The colleague's anger, the family member's anxiety, the stranger's rudeness. These things can pass through the room without automatically becoming yours to carry, and that capacity, according to the research, is a skill built over years, not a wall built out of coldness. If you've noticed yourself feeling less swept away by other people's emotional storms than you used to, able to stay warm and present without absorbing every feeling in the room as your own, that isn't you becoming distant. According to decades of research on emotion regulation, differentiation, and non-attachment, it's one of the clearest markers of psychological maturity available, and it makes you a steadier, more reliable presence for the people who actually need you to stay regulated when everything around them isn't. Chapter 19, Why Patience Becomes a Superpower. I want to open this chapter with one of the most famous studies in psychology because it sets up everything that follows perfectly. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, psychologist Walter Mischel conducted what became known as the marshmallow test at Stanford University, offering young children a choice. Eat one marshmallow now, or wait a short period alone in a room with it and receive 2 marshmallows later. Follow-up research tracking these same children for decades found that the ones who were able to delay gratification as preschoolers went on average, to show better academic performance, healthier relationships, and stronger stress coping skills as adults. What's less commonly discussed about Mischel's later work, though, is his equally important finding that delay of gratification ability is not fixed. It can be developed and strengthened throughout life through specific cognitive strategies, and there's compelling evidence that this capacity, on average, continues developing well into midlife and beyond. Let's look at why patience specifically improves with age, because the mechanisms are more concrete than wisdom as a vague concept. research on what's called temporal discounting, the tendency to value immediate rewards more highly than larger future rewards, has found, through studies including work by behavioral economist George Lowenstein, that the steepness of temporal discounting tends to decrease with age. In practical terms, this means that a 45-year-old, on average, finds it measurably easier to prioritize a larger future reward over a smaller immediate one than a 25-year-old does. This isn't simply a matter of increased willpower. Research suggests it's tied to broader neurological maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, which continues developing and refining its connectivity into a person's 30s and shows continued efficiency gains well beyond that. There's a specific and important distinction worth making here between raw self-control and what researchers increasingly call situational self-regulation strategy. Psychologist Angela Duckworth, known for her research on grit and self-control, found in extensive studies that the people who appear most patient and self-controlled generally aren't relying primarily on effortful, in-the-moment willpower. They're relying on structural strategies developed through experience, removing themselves from tempting situations in advance, reframing difficult weights in more tolerable terms, and recognizing early warning signs of impulsive urges before they peak. By 40, most people have had decades of practice developing exactly these kinds of personalized strategies, often without consciously realizing they've built them, which is a major part of why patience starts to feel less like a strained effort and more like a stable trait. I want to bring in research on financial decision-making here, because it offers some of the clearest real-world evidence of growing patience with age. Studies on retirement savings behavior and long-term financial planning, including research published by behavioral economists studying the life cycle hypothesis of savings behavior, consistently find that willingness to delay financial gratification, saving now for a benefit decades away, increases substantially from early adulthood into midlife, even controlling for changes in income. This pattern shows up across numerous other domains too. Health behavior research finds that willingness to endure short-term discomfort, exercise, dietary changes for long-term benefit also increases with age, as does patience in professional contexts, such as willingness to invest years in mastering a skill rather than seeking immediate recognition. There's a psychological reframe here that I think deserves real attention. Patience, according to decades of self-regulation research, isn't primarily about suppressing the urge for immediate reward through sheer effort. It's about your relationship with the future itself changing. Research on future self-continuity, a concept studied extensively by psychologist Hal Hershfield, found that people vary considerably in how psychologically connected they feel to their own future selves. Some people relate to their future self almost like a stranger, which makes present moment sacrifice for that future self's benefit feel pointless, while others feel a strong, continuous connection to who they'll become, which makes delaying gratification for that future self's sake feel almost like caring for a loved one rather than depriving yourself. Hershfield's research found that this sense of future self-continuity tends to strengthen with age and lived experience, largely because by 40, you have actually lived long enough to watch your past choices shape your present reality, which makes the abstract concept of future me considerably more concrete and real than it could ever be at 25. I also want to mention research on patience within relationships specifically, because it connects directly to themes from earlier chapters. Studies on conflict resolution in long-term relationships, including work drawing on Gottman's research, introduced in Chapter 12, found that the ability to tolerate short-term relational discomfort, sitting with an unresolved disagreement without needing to immediately force resolution, allowing a partner space to process rather than pushing for instant repair, is one of the strongest predictors of long-term relationship stability. And this specific capacity has been shown to improve measurably with relationship experience and age. There's something worth naming plainly here, and patience, as it develops after 40, stops being a moral virtue you have to strain toward and starts becoming something closer to a genuine cognitive advantage, a structural change in how you weigh immediate versus future rewards. Built from a more mature prefrontal cortex, a more continuous relationship with your own future self, and decades of accumulated personal strategy for managing impulse. This is precisely why patience is often described, quite accurately, as a superpower, because unlike many strengths, it compounds. Every patient decision you make builds slightly more evidence, slightly more skill, and slightly more neurological efficiency for the next one, if you've noticed yourself able to wait. For a relationship to develop trust, for a career to mature, for a difficult conversation to resolve on its own timeline rather than forcing it, without the old gnawing urgency, that isn't resignation. According to decades of research on self-regulation, temporal discounting, and future self-continuity, it's one of the most valuable cognitive assets a human being can develop, and it was simply never available to you until you had lived long enough to build it. Chapter 20. The confidence that doesn't need validation. I want to close this part of the book with what I think is the natural culmination of everything we've discussed so far, a specific kind of confidence that doesn't ask anyone else's permission to exist. This is different from the confidence we discussed in Chapter 4, which was built from mastery, experience, and competence. This chapter is about something slightly different and, in some ways, even more foundational, confidence that isn't contingent on external validation at all. Let's start with the psychological framework that explains this shift most precisely. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deckey and Richard Ryan, which we've referenced throughout this book. Their extensive body of research distinguishes between what they call contingent self-esteem, self-worth that rises and falls based on external outcomes like approval, achievement, or comparison to others, and what they call true self-esteem or intrinsic self-worth, which remains relatively stable regardless of external validation because it's rooted in a person's own internalized values and sense of authenticity. Deckey and Ryan's decades of research consistently found that contingent self-esteem, while common in younger adults navigating early identity formation, is associated with significantly higher anxiety, depression, and what they call ego involvement, a defensive, fragile relationship with one's own successes and failures. True self-esteem, by contrast, correlates with markedly higher psychological well-being and resilience. Why does the shift from contingent to true self-esteem tend to happen after 40 specifically? Part of the answer draws together nearly everything we've discussed so far in this book. By midlife, most people have accumulated enough achievements, enough failures, enough approval and enough disapproval to have run the actual experiment. Does external validation, once received, produce lasting satisfaction? For most people, the honest answer, gathered through years of direct evidence rather than theory, is no. The promotion felt good for a week, the compliment felt good for a day, and then the baseline returned to whatever it was before. Psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky's research on what's called hedonic adaptation, The well-documented tendency for the emotional impact of both positive and negative events to fade back toward a baseline level of happiness surprisingly quickly helps explain why external validation, no matter how much of it you accumulate, never permanently satisfies the hunger for it. By 40, most people have enough repeated experience with this exact letdown to finally stop expecting the next achievement or compliment to be the one that finally, permanently fills that gap. There's a related and important body of research here on what psychologist Carol Dweck, known for her extensive work on mindset, calls the difference between performance orientation and learning orientation. People with a strong performance orientation derive their sense of worth primarily from how their performance compares to others or to external standards, a structure that makes self-worth inherently unstable since it depends entirely on outcomes outside your full control. People with a learning orientation, by contrast, derive satisfaction from the process of growth and mastery itself, a structure that Dweck's research found produces significantly more stable motivation and self-worth over time, because it doesn't depend on constantly winning external comparisons. Dweck's longitudinal research, along with related studies on mindset development, has found that people generally shift toward a stronger learning orientation with age and experience, particularly after enough exposure to the diminishing returns of pure performance chasing. I want to bring in a concept from research on identity development here that I think captures something important. Psychologist James Marcia's influential framework on identity status describes a developmental process in which people move from identity diffusion, no clear sense of self, easily swayed by external opinion, through a period of active exploration and ideally toward what Marcia called identity achievement, a stable, self-defined sense of identity that has been actively examined and chosen rather than passively absorbed from external expectations. Marcia's research, along with decades of follow-up studies extending his framework into midlife, found that identity achievement, once reached, correlates strongly with reduced need for external validation, because a person who has done the work of genuinely defining their own values and identity no longer needs others to confirm that identity in order to feel secure in it. I think it's worth being honest about something here. This kind of confidence is genuinely rare, even among people well past 40, and I don't want to suggest it arrives automatically just because a certain number of years have passed. Research on self-esteem stability across the lifespan, including studies published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, found meaningful individual variation. While average self-esteem stability does increase with age across large populations, some people continue to show highly contingent, validation-dependent self-worth well into their 60s and beyond, particularly if their earlier life circumstances didn't provide the kind of corrective, evidence-gathering experiences described throughout this book. The shift this chapter describes is common and statistically likely with age, but it isn't guaranteed. It tends to require, alongside the simple passage of time, some degree of active reflection on what you actually value, independent of what you've been praised or criticized for along the way. There's a final, practical marker of this kind of confidence worth naming, because I think it's the clearest test of whether it's genuinely developed. The ability to do good, meaningful work, raise a child well, build something worthwhile, treat people with integrity, without needing anyone to witness or acknowledge it, in order for the effort to feel worthwhile. Research on intrinsic motivation, again drawing on Dekai and Ryan's foundational work, found that this capacity, finding an action worthwhile, purely because it aligns with your own values, independent of recognition, is one of the strongest predictors of sustained well-being and life satisfaction across the adult lifespan, considerably more predictive than external achievement itself. If you've noticed that you no longer need someone to notice this, praise, or confirm the things you do well in order for those things to feel worthwhile, that a quiet, well-lived Tuesday feels complete on its own terms, without an audience, that isn't detachment from the world. According to decades of research on self-determination, identity development, and intrinsic motivation, it's the single clearest sign that you've finally built a self that doesn't need anyone else's permission to exist. Part 5. The Second Life. Chapter 21. Reinventing Yourself After 40. I want to start this chapter by dismantling one of the most persistent and least accurate myths in popular culture. The idea that your identity, your career, and your capacity for major life change essentially solidify by your 30s, leaving little room for genuine reinvention afterward. The research doesn't just contradict this idea, it dismantles it almost entirely. Let's start with neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. For decades, neuroscience assumed that the adult brain was largely fixed after early development. That assumption has been thoroughly overturned by research, including the work of neuroscientist Michael Merzenich, one of the pioneers of neuroplasticity research, whose studies demonstrated that the adult brain retains substantial capacity for structural change well into old age, particularly in response to focused, novel learning experiences. Merzenich's research, along with decades of subsequent studies, found that learning a genuinely new skill, a language, an instrument, a new professional domain, produces measurable structural changes in the adult brain at any age, though the process typically requires more deliberate, sustained practice than it did in youth, when the brain's baseline plasticity was naturally higher. There's compelling real-world data on career reinvention specifically that I think deserves attention. Research on career changes, including data compiled by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and analyzed in career longevity studies, has found that a substantial and growing proportion of significant career pivots, not minor job changes, but genuine shifts into entirely new fields, occur after age 40, often driven by a combination of accumulated transferable skills, financial stability that provides room to take calculated risks, and the values clarification process we discussed extensively in Part 1 of this book. Journalist and researcher Rich Karlgaard, in his extensively researched book on what he calls late bloomers, compiled data across multiple fields showing that a striking number of major entrepreneurial successes, artistic achievements, and leadership positions are launched or achieved well after age 40. A pattern the data shows consistently across decades, even though media narratives disproportionately celebrate young prodigies. I want to bring in a specific and useful psychological framework here, the concept of possible selves, developed by psychologists Hazel Marcus and Paula Nurius, which describes the different versions of who we might become that we carry, consciously or unconsciously, as motivational templates. Their research found that people at every life stage maintain a repertoire of possible selves, hoped-for selves, feared selves, expected selves, and that the activation of a genuinely compelling, hoped-for possible self is one of the strongest predictors of successful major life change at any age. What changes by midlife isn't the mechanism of reinvention itself, which remains available throughout life. What changes is the content of the possible selves people find compelling, shifting away from externally validated versions. The famous version, the wealthy version, and toward the more intrinsically meaningful versions we discussed in Chapter 20. There's an important practical advantage that reinvention after 40 carries, which younger reinvention typically lacks: accumulated transferable skill and self-knowledge. Research on career transitions conducted by organizational psychologist Herminia Ibarra, whose extensive work on professional identity and reinvention has become foundational in this field, found that successful midlife career changes rarely start from zero, even when the new field looks completely different from the outside. Ibarra's research identified a pattern she calls identity capital: accumulated skills, reputation, and self-knowledge from a prior career that transfer, often in non-obvious ways, into a new domain. A 48-year-old switching from corporate law to running a small business, for instance, doesn't lose the negotiation skill, risk assessment, and discipline built over 2 decades of legal practice. Those become foundational assets in the new venture, in a way that a 22-year-old starting the same business simply cannot access yet. I think it's worth naming honestly the specific fears that tend to hold people back from reinvention at this stage, because the research offers genuinely useful counter-evidence for most of them. The fear of financial risk is real and legitimate, but research on entrepreneurship and career transitions has found that midlife career changes, despite popular assumption, are not statistically more likely to fail financially than younger entrepreneurs. In fact, some studies, including research published examining startup founder age and success rates, found that founders over 40 had, on average, higher success rates than young founders, largely attributable to the accumulated experience and networks discussed above. The fear of being too old to start over similarly doesn't hold up against Karlgaard's late bloomer research or Ibarra's identity capital findings. What holds people back is rarely a genuine biological or cognitive limitation, and far more often simply the social narrative that reinvention belongs to the young. There's a psychological cost to not reinventing when reinvention is genuinely called, for that's worth naming too. Connecting back to Erikson's generativity versus stagnation framework from Chapter 2, research on career stagnation and psychological well-being has found that remaining in a role or identity that has stopped feeling meaningful, purely out of inertia or fear, correlates with the kind of emotional exhaustion and depersonalization we discussed extensively in Chapter 7. In other words, the risk calculation many people run, weighing the risk of reinvention against the safety of staying put, often miscounts the real cost of staying, because that cost is slow, cumulative, and easy to underestimate compared to the immediate, visible risk of change. If you felt a pull toward reinvention after 40, a new career, a new creative pursuit, a genuinely different version of your life than the one you built in your 20s and 30s, I want you to know that the research overwhelmingly supports the idea that you are not too late, and you are not starting from nothing. According to decades of research on neuroplasticity, career transitions and identity capital, you are, in fact, better equipped for meaningful reinvention now than you have ever been in your entire life, carrying more transferable skill, more self-knowledge, and more accurate judgment than the version of you who might have attempted this same leap 20 years earlier. Chapter 22. Why most people peak too early. I want to challenge something that most of us absorbed so early and so thoroughly that we rarely question it. The cultural assumption that human potential peaks somewhere in your 20s or early 30s, and that everything afterward is a slow management of decline. The research tells a substantially different and far more encouraging story, one that depends heavily on what, specifically you mean by peak. Let's start with cognitive research, building on the fluid versus crystallized intelligent from Chapter 4. Cognitive scientist Joshua Hartshorne, in research published examining cognitive performance across the lifespan using large-scale online testing data, found that different cognitive abilities peak at dramatically different ages. Raw processing speed and working memory peak relatively early, around the late teens to early 20s, but the ability to understand others' emotional states peaks in the 40s. The ability to interpret complex social and factual situations continues improving into the 50s, and vocabulary and accumulated knowledge, remarkably, continue increasing into a person's late 60s and 70s before finally plateauing. Hartshorne's research directly challenges the single peak age narrative. There is no single peak because human cognition isn't a single ability. It's dozens of distinct capacities, each with its own developmental trajectory. There's compelling career-specific data that supports this too. Research on the age of peak achievement across professional fields, including a large-scale study led by economists at Northwestern University analyzing patent data, entrepreneurial success, and scientific breakthroughs, found that the average age of peak innovative output across many fields is considerably later than commonly assumed, often in the mid-40s to 50s, rather than the 20s typically celebrated in popular narratives about prodigies. The researchers found that this pattern held even after controlling for career length, suggesting the finding reflects genuine capability development rather than simply more years to work with. Rich Karlgaard's extensive compilation of late bloomer data, referenced in the previous chapter, adds further texture to this picture, documenting numerous highly successful individuals across business, science, and the arts whose most significant achievements arrived well after the age at which popular culture assumes peak potential has passed. I want to bring in research on expertise development specifically because it explains the mechanism behind why so many meaningful peaks arrive later than expected. Psychologist Anders Ericsson, whose extensive research on expertise and what's popularly known as the 10,000-hour rule remains foundational in this field, though the specific number has been refined and debated in subsequent research, found that genuine mastery in complex domains, the kind that produces truly exceptional, field-defining work, typically requires roughly 10 to 15 years of deliberate, focused practice at minimum, often considerably longer in highly complex fields. Simple arithmetic explains a great deal here. Someone who begins seriously pursuing a field at 25, following Ericsson's research on expertise timelines, would be expected to reach genuine mastery somewhere in their late 30s to 40s, which aligns closely with the peak achievement ages found in the Northwestern research described above. There's a particularly important piece of this puzzle that connects to something we discussed in earlier chapters: the compounding relationship between crystallized intelligence, pattern recognition, and creative output. A common misconception assumes that creativity and innovation are primarily products of fluid intelligence, the raw mental agility that peaks early, and therefore assumes creative peaks must also occur early. But research on creative achievement across fields, including studies analyzing the career trajectories of Nobel laureates conducted by economist David Galenson, found that creative fields actually split into two distinct patterns. What Galenson calls conceptual innovators, who tend to produce breakthrough work early through bold, unconventional new ideas, and experimental innovators, who tend to produce their most significant work later in life through years of iterative refinement, accumulated technique, and deepening understanding of their craft. Gellinson's research found that experimental innovation, which depends heavily on crystallized expertise, is actually the more common pattern across most creative fields, not the exception, meaning the popular narrative of the young creative genius, while real, represents a specific minority pattern rather than the dominant one. I think it's worth naming honestly why the peak too early narrative persists so strongly in culture despite this substantial contrary evidence. Youth is simply more visually and narratively compelling in a media landscape built around novelty, and young achievement, being statistically rarer relative to the population of young people, generates disproportionate attention and mythologizing. This creates a systematic bias in what stories get told and remembered, even though the underlying data on peak achievement, cognitive development, and expertise timelines tells a fuller, more mid- and later life-friendly story. There's a final piece of research worth mentioning that speaks directly to the emotional experience of this chapter's topic. Studies on subjective perception of one's own peak, including survey research asking adults at various ages to identify when they felt they were doing their best work, found that self-reported peak experiences were reported across a remarkably wide range of ages, with a notable proportion of respondents in their 50s and 60s identifying their peak as still ahead of, or currently happening in their present decade, not behind them. This subjective finding, combined with the objective research on cognitive and career peaks described throughout this chapter, suggests something worth internalizing deeply. The idea that your best years are necessarily behind you by midlife isn't a neutral observation about human development. According to the actual research, for a great many people, in a great many domains, it simply isn't true. If you've quietly assumed that your best work, your best ideas, or your most significant achievements are already behind you, I want to gently push back on that assumption using the evidence available. According to decades of research on cognitive development, expertise, and creative achievement, you may well be standing closer to your actual peak than you think, not despite the years behind you, but because of them. Chapter 23, The Freedom of Letting Go. I want to open this chapter with a distinction that resolves a lot of confusion around the idea of letting go, because the phrase gets used so loosely in popular self-help culture that it's often stripped of anything useful. Letting go, according to serious psychological research, isn't about pretending something doesn't matter or forcing yourself to stop caring. It's a specific, learnable cognitive and emotional process, and understanding its actual mechanics makes it dramatically more achievable than the vague, inspirational version most people encounter. Let's start with acceptance and commitment therapy, often abbreviated as ACT, a well-researched therapeutic approach developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes. ACT is built around a core insight that directly addresses what letting go actually means at a psychological level, rather than trying to eliminate or control difficult thoughts and feelings. An approach research consistently shows tends to backfire, a phenomenon studied extensively under the term ironic process theory by psychologist Daniel Wegner, who famously demonstrated that actively trying not to think about something, like a white bear, paradoxically increases its presence in your mind. ACT teaches what's called psychological flexibility, the capacity to hold difficult thoughts and feelings without being controlled by them, while still taking meaningful action aligned with your values. Extensive clinical research on ACT, including numerous randomized controlled trials, has found it to be highly effective for exactly the kind of stuck, ruminative letting-go difficulties, grief, regret, anger at past events that tend to accumulate by midlife. There's a specific concept within this research worth naming directly: the difference between clean pain and dirty pain, a distinction used in ACT-informed clinical work. Clean pain refers to the unavoidable, appropriate emotional response to a genuine loss or disappointment, grief over a relationship that ended, sadness about a path not taken. Dirty pain refers to the additional suffering generated by fighting against, resisting, or endlessly narrating the original pain, the suffering caused not by the loss itself, but by your relationship to the loss. Research on rumination, including extensive work by psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, found that the tendency to ruminate, replaying distressing events repeatedly without resolution, was one of the strongest predictors of prolonged depression and anxiety following a difficult life event, considerably more predictive than the severity of the original event itself. Letting go, understood through this research, isn't about eliminating clean pain, which is often simply the appropriate cost of having cared about something. It's about interrupting the dirty pain, the additional layer of suffering generated by resistance and rumination that sits on top of it. I want to bring in research on grief specifically here, because it offers one of the clearest illustrations of how genuine letting go actually functions. Psychiatrist George Bonanno's extensive research on grief and resilience, which challenged decades of assumptions about grief, requiring fixed, linear stages, found that most people navigating even severe loss show what he calls a resilient trajectory, the capacity to hold genuine ongoing grief alongside continued engagement with life, meaning and even joy, rather than needing to fully resolve the grief before moving forward. Bonanno's research found that healthy adaptation to loss doesn't require forgetting or fully detaching from what was lost. It involves developing what he describes as a capacity to carry the loss, while continuing to build a full life alongside it. This reframes letting go away from the popular image of erasing or forgetting, and towards something more accurate, integration. There's a related concept worth mentioning from Buddhist psychology, which has increasingly been studied alongside and integrated with Western clinical research through the growing field of contemplative science. The concept of non-attachment, distinct from detachment, which we touched on briefly in Chapter 18. Research on mindfulness and non-attachment, including studies led by psychologist Kirk Warren Brown, found that non-attachment, engaging fully with life and relationships while holding outcomes loosely, without desperate clinging to how things should turn out, correlates strongly with psychological well-being, considerably more so than either full attachment, anxious clinging to outcomes, or full detachment, disengaging to avoid potential loss. Letting go, in this framework, isn't the opposite of caring. It's a specific, more sustainable way of caring that doesn't require controlling the uncontrollable in order to feel okay. Why does this capacity tend to develop more fully after 40? Part of the answer draws together nearly everything discussed in this book so far: the improved emotional regulation from Chapter 18, the growing patience from Chapter 19, the reduced fear of negative evaluation from Chapter 13, and, perhaps most directly, the simple accumulated evidence gathered from decades of lived experience that things you once believed you couldn't survive losing were in fact survivable. Research on resilience and post-traumatic growth, which we discussed in Chapter 8, found that surviving significant loss or disappointment, while genuinely painful, tends to build what researchers call self-efficacy for coping. A concrete, evidence-based confidence in your own capacity to endure hardship, which makes future letting-go processes measurably less frightening, because you've now personally proven, more than once, that you can survive them. I think it's worth being honest about something here that I don't want to gloss over. Letting go, even when psychologically healthy, is rarely instantaneous, and research on rumination and grief consistently shows that it operates more like a gradual erosion than a single decisive act. The popular image of just letting go as a discrete choice you make in a single moment doesn't match the research particularly well. What the research does support is that certain practices, cognitive reappraisal, mindfulness-based non-attachment, and interrupting rumination when you notice it happening, measurably accelerate a process that would otherwise unfold much more slowly and painfully on its own. If you've noticed an increasing capacity to hold a past disappointment, a lost relationship, or an old regret without it dominating your present the way it once did, that isn't forgetting, and it isn't suppression. According to decades of research on acceptance, grief, and non-attachment, it's the specific, learnable skill of integration finally taking hold, the ability to carry what happened without needing it to control what happens next. Chapter 24. The Hidden Advantage Younger People Don't See. I want to spend this chapter naming something directly that has been implicit throughout much of this book. There is a specific, well-researched form of intelligence that simply cannot exist without the passage of significant time, no matter how naturally gifted or hard-working a younger person might be. Psychologists call it wisdom, and unlike raw intelligence, it has been studied rigorously enough to have a measurable, well-defined structure. Let's start with what's widely considered the most influential research program on this topic. The Berlin Wisdom Paradigm, developed by psychologist Paul Baltes and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute over several decades of research. Baltes defined wisdom not as a vague personality trait, but as a specific, measurable, expert knowledge system concerning what he called the fundamental pragmatics of life, deep, practical knowledge about the conditions of life, human nature, and the difficult, often unresolvable dilemmas people face. His research team developed rigorous methods for measuring wisdom-related performance by presenting participants with complex, ambiguous life problems. For example, a scenario involving a difficult family or career dilemma with no clean solution, and evaluating their responses against 5 specific criteria: rich factual knowledge about life, rich procedural knowledge about how to handle life problems, awareness of how context and lifespan factors shape decisions, recognition that values and priorities differ across people and situations, and comfort with uncertainty and the fundamental unpredictability of life. The findings from decades of research using this framework are genuinely striking. Baltes and colleagues found that while raw wisdom-related performance shows significant individual variation, plenty of younger people score higher than plenty of older people, meaning age alone doesn't guarantee wisdom. The ceiling of wisdom-related performance and the average level across large samples both increase measurably from young adulthood through midlife and beyond, plateauing only quite late in life. Crucially, the research found that wisdom, as measured through this rigorous framework, correlates only weakly with raw cognitive ability or IQ, and instead correlates strongly with specific life experiences, navigating genuinely difficult personal challenges, exposure to diverse perspectives and life circumstances, and, importantly, active reflection on those experiences, rather than simply living through them passively. I want to name a related concept here that I think captures something younger people genuinely cannot access yet: no matter their raw intellectual gifts. What researchers studying decision-making under uncertainty call calibrated confidence. The ability to accurately judge how much confidence a given decision or belief actually deserves, rather than either overestimating or underestimating your own certainty. Research on overconfidence, including extensive work by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose research on cognitive biases fundamentally reshaped the field of behavioral economics, found that overconfidence in judgment tends to be highest specifically among people with moderate experience. Enough to feel capable, not enough to have encountered the full range of ways a confident judgment can turn out to be wrong. This produces a specific and counterintuitive pattern. The sweet spot of maximum overconfidence often occurs in early to mid-career, precisely when competence feels newly established, while genuinely accurate self-calibration, knowing what you don't know, and knowing how much weight to place on what you do know, tends to develop later, built from an accumulated personal history of confident judgments that turned out, humbling, to be wrong. There's a specific, practical version of this hidden advantage worth naming directly: the capacity to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to collapse them into a single simple answer. Research on cognitive complexity, including studies building on developmental psychologist William Perry's influential research on intellectual development, found that the capacity for what's sometimes called dialectical thinking, the ability to genuinely accept that two seemingly opposing perspectives can both contain real truth, rather than needing to declare one entirely right and the other entirely wrong, tends to develop specifically through extended exposure to genuinely complicated life situations that don't resolve into clean, satisfying answers. Younger adults, according to this research, tend to show a stronger preference for clear, binary judgments. This isn't a failure of intelligence, but simply a reflection of not yet having accumulated enough situations where the obviously correct answer at age 25 turned out, by age 40, to have been considerably more complicated than it first appeared. I think it's worth being honest about why this particular advantage is so easy for younger people to underestimate or dismiss from the outside. And it connects to something we discussed in Chapter 22. Wisdom, unlike raw processing speed or technical skill, doesn't announce itself impressively in the kinds of settings, timed tests, fast-paced debates, rapid problem-solving, that tend to be most visible and most celebrated in youth-oriented cultural and professional environments. Baltus's research specifically found that wisdom-related performance shows its clearest advantages precisely in slow, ambiguous, high-stakes situations without a single correct answer, mentoring someone through a difficult life decision, navigating a genuinely complex ethical dilemma, providing calm perspective during a family crisis. Situations that simply don't showcase well in the fast, competitive settings where younger achievement tends to get noticed and rewarded. There's a final piece of this puzzle worth naming, because it offers a hopeful, actionable note to close this chapter on. Baltus's research found that wisdom-related performance isn't simply a passive byproduct of aging. It correlates specifically with what he called wisdom-related life experiences, meaning that simply getting older without genuine reflection, difficulty, or exposure to varied perspectives does not reliably produce wisdom on its own. This means the advantage described in this chapter isn't guaranteed by the calendar alone, but it also means it's available, at least in part, to anyone willing to actively reflect on difficulty rather than simply endure it, which is, in many ways, exactly what reading a book like this one represents. If you've noticed yourself able to sit comfortably with an unresolved, ambiguous problem that would have driven you to demand a quick, clean answer 20 years ago, able to see genuine merit in perspectives that contradict each other, able to advise someone younger with a calm, calibrated confidence you couldn't have manufactured at their age, that isn't indecisiveness. According to decades of rigorous wisdom research, it's the single clearest advantage the passage of time can offer, and it's one that no amount of raw talent, speed, or intelligence can substitute for. Chapter 25. The Greatest Lesson Life Teaches After 40. We've covered a great deal of ground together in this book, 24 chapters spanning the rewiring of ambition, the recalibration of trust, the transformation of relationships, and the quiet, hard-won power that develops with time. I want to use this final chapter to draw all of it toward a single point, because I believe the research, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it, converges on one central lesson more than any other. Let's return, one last time, to Erik Erikson, whose framework has threaded through much of this book. Erikson proposed that human psychosocial development unfolds through 8 sequential stages, each centered on a specific tension to be resolved. We discussed the 7th stage, generativity versus stagnation, in Chapter 2. The 8th and final stage, which Erikson placed in late life, but which extensive follow-up research suggests, begins its groundwork considerably earlier, he called integrity versus despair. Integrity in Erikson's framework refers to the capacity to look back across the whole of one's life, its choices, its failures, its accidents of circumstance, and arrive at a fundamental sense of acceptance that the life lived, imperfect as it was, held coherence and was worth having lived. Despair, the opposing pole, involves looking back at that same life and experiencing it primarily as a series of regrets, wasted opportunities, and irreversible mistakes with no redeeming shape. Here is what I find most important about Erikson's research and the decades of work that followed it. Integrity is not achieved by having lived a mistake-free life. Erikson was explicit about this, and subsequent research on his framework, including extensive work by psychologist James Marcia, introduced in Chapter 20, confirms it. Integrity is achieved through the active integration of a life's full contents, its genuine failures alongside its genuine successes, into a coherent narrative that a person can accept as their own. This connects directly to nearly every theme in this book. The regret we discussed in Chapter 9 doesn't need to be eliminated to achieve integrity. It needs to be integrated, understood, and allowed to inform rather than define you. The betrayal from Chapter 8 doesn't need to be forgotten. It needs to be woven into an accurate, ultimately survivable story about who you are and what you've learned. The reinvention from Chapter 21, the letting go from Chapter 23, the wisdom from Chapter 24. Each of these is, in its own way, a specific mechanism for building exactly the kind of integrated life narrative that Erikson identified as the central task of this entire stage of development. There's a substantial body of research validating just how consequential this task actually is. Studies on what psychologists call narrative identity, a research program led significantly by psychologist Dan McAdams, found that the specific way people construct the story of their own lives, particularly how they make sense of difficult or painful chapters within that story, is one of the strongest predictors of overall psychological well-being in midlife and beyond, considerably more predictive than the objective content of what actually happened to them. Two people can experience remarkably similar hardships, a career setback, a difficult divorce, a period of real struggle, and end up with dramatically different levels of well-being, not based on the severity of the hardship itself, but based on whether they were able to construct what McAdams calls a redemptive narrative, in which difficulty is eventually integrated into a story of growth and meaning, versus what he calls a contamination narrative, in which even previously good chapters of life become retroactively poisoned by how a difficult period is remembered. I think this is the thread that ties together everything we've explored in this book. From the death of endless ambition in Chapter 2 to the freedom of letting go in Chapter 23, the second half of life isn't primarily about acquiring new things, new achievements, new relationships, new experiences, the way the first half so often was. It's primarily about making sense of what you've already lived, and doing so in a way that lets you move forward with clarity rather than being quietly weighed down by everything left unintegrated behind you. This is, I think, the real meaning behind the idea I introduced at the very start of this book, that turning 40 doesn't just make you older, it changes the operating system of your mind. The upgrade isn't primarily about new ability, it's about the capacity, finally, to look backward and forward at the same time, and find both directions bearable. There's a final piece of research I want to leave you with, because I think it offers something genuinely useful as you close this book and return to your own life. The Harvard study of adult development, which we referenced in Chapter 11, and which remains, at the time of this writing, the longest-running study of adult life ever conducted, tracked its original participants from young adult into their 90s, along with, in later phases, their children and grandchildren. Its most consistently replicated headline finding, delivered by its longtime director, psychiatrist Robert Waldinger, is disarmingly simple. The single strongest predictor of health, happiness, and life satisfaction across the entire adult lifespan was not wealth, fame, achievement, or even physical health itself. It was the quality of a person's close relationships, not the number of relationships, not their intensity or novelty, their quality, their reliability, their depth. If you trace that finding back through every chapter of this book, you'll notice it fits perfectly with everything we've discussed. The shrinking circle from Chapter 10 that leaves only the relationships that matter. The earned trust from Chapter 6 that makes the remaining relationships more solid than they've ever been. The honest conversations from Chapter 12 that deepen intimacy rather than eroding it. The security from Chapter 14 that finally lets you stop fearing loss in the relationships that have proven themselves. Nearly everything this book has described. The quieting of approval-seeking, the maturing of ambition, the sharpening of discernment, the growth of patience, ultimately serves this one outcome. It clears away the noise, the performance, and the fear that once stood between you and the handful of relationships and pursuits that actually make a life worth having lived. So here, at the end, is the greatest lesson life seems to teach after 40, gathered from every study, every framework, and every researcher we've walked through together in this book. It was never really about becoming someone new. It was about finally becoming accurate. Accurate about what deserves your trust, your energy, your patience, and your remaining years. And once you become accurate, the life that's left to live, however much or little of it there is, tends to become extraordinarily clear about what actually matters. That clarity, more than any single achievement this book has described, is the real second life waiting on the other side of 40. Conclusion. The second half of life isn't about getting older, it's about finally seeing clearly. When I sat down to write this book, I told you it wouldn't be about aging skin or retirement accounts, and I want to close by making good on that promise one more time. Because if you've read this far, You already know that everything we've explored together has actually been about something far more interesting than the number of candles on a cake. Let's take stock of the journey. We began with the mind rewriting itself, the fading need for universal approval, backed by research on the spotlight effect and amygdala reactivity, the maturing of ambition, grounded in Erikson's generativity framework, and the U-shaped happiness curve documented by Blanchflower and Oswald, the growing appetite for solitude, explained through Dekai and Ryan's self-determination theory, and Carstenson's research on emotional regulation. The quiet confidence built from Cattell's crystallized intelligence and Bandura's mastery experiences, and the sharpening preciousness of time itself, rooted in Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory, arguably the single most important framework running through this entire book. Then we walked into harder terrain. The dark side of maturity that fewer books are willing to name honestly, the shrinking of trust, understood through Rotter's research and the neuroscience of oxytocin and betrayal recovery. The specific, measurable exhaustion of Maslach's burnout framework and McEwen's allostatic load, the permanent, though not necessarily damaging, recalibration that follows genuine betrayal, softened by Tedeschi's research on post-traumatic growth. The invisible weight of regret, given real shape by Gilovich and Medvek's research on action versus inaction, and the shrinking, deepening social circle, explained by Dunbar's layered model of human relationships and the quality over quantity findings that appear again and again throughout the relationship research cited in this book. From there, we explored how relationships themselves transform, attraction reweighting itself from novelty toward reliability, conversations sharpening into honesty as the fear of disapproval fades, people-pleasing giving way to genuine boundaries, the fading fear of losing people who've proven, through repeated evidence, that they're staying, and a manipulation radar sharpened by decades of pattern recognition that no younger person, however sharp, has yet had time to build. Then came what I called the new power, the strategic weight of silence, the guilt-free clarity of a boundary, the healthy detachment that lets you stay present without absorbing every storm in the room, the compounding advantage of patience, and finally, a form of confidence that doesn't need anyone's permission or applause to feel real. And finally, the second life, reinvention that's backed by neuroplasticity research and identity capital theory rather than wishful thinking, the recognition, grounded in Hartshorne's cognitive research and Gellinson's studies of creative achievement, that most people are nowhere near as past their peak as the culture insists, the specific, learnable mechanics of letting go, drawn from acceptance and commitment therapy and Bonanno's grief research, the hidden, hard-won advantage of wisdom that Paul Baltus spent decades trying to measure, and the single lesson that Erikson, McAdams, and the Harvard study of adult development all seem to arrive at from entirely different directions, that a well-lived second half of life isn't measured by what you acquire, but by how well you've made sense of what you've already lived, and who you've chosen to keep close while you do it. I want to leave you with something practical before we part ways, because I don't think a book like this should end purely in reflection. If even one part of what you've read here resonated with your own life, here is what the research, taken as a whole, seems to suggest you do with it. Stop apologizing for the relationships that have quietly fallen away. They were very likely never the ones sustaining you to begin with. Extend trust slowly and deliberately, and don't mistake that deliberateness for coldness. It's discernment you earned the hard way. Let your ambition redirect towards something that will outlast you, rather than mourning the version of it that once needed an audience. Say the honest thing sooner rather than later, because the research on regret makes painfully clear which kind lingers longest. And above all, invest disproportionately in the small number of relationships that have already proven, through actual evidence rather than hope, that they can hold weight. Because according to nearly a century of combined research referenced throughout this book, that investment, more than any other single factor, determines whether the years ahead of you feel worth having lived. You are not declining. You are not fading, softening into irrelevance, or watching your best years disappear in the rearview mirror. According to the actual data, the U-shaped happiness curve, the rising crystallized intelligence, the later career peaks, the deepening relationship satisfaction, the growing wisdom scores, you are, in very measurable ways, entering the strongest, clearest, most capable stretch of your entire life. It doesn't always feel that way in the moment, especially somewhere in the difficult trough of your 40s that Blanchflower and Oswald's research maps so precisely. But if their data holds, and it has held consistently across 80 countries and several decades of replication, what's waiting on the other side of that trough is not decline, it's ascent. So, if you take only one thing from everything we've covered together, let it be this. The second half of life was never a slow walk away from who you were. It was always a walk toward who you actually are, the version of you that finally stopped performing, finally stopped apologizing for your own limits, and finally started paying attention to what was true instead of what was expected. That version of you was always in there. It just took 40 years, give or take, for the noise to quiet down enough for you to finally hear it. Welcome to the second half. According to everything we've walked through together in this book, it's the part worth being here for.